All right, folks. Well, as Kay had said, my name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead for social studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. As always, we're trying to figure this stuff out together. I know that becomes an overused phrase, and yet I don't know how else to approach a set of standards that don't really come with a lot of money for professional development, don't come with a lot of money for materials, and then there's not actually a lot of stuff out there that aligns to these standards, right? And so we're trying to create a much larger sort of coalition of understanding this. And so what we're going to share today, as I always say, is that this is how we're sort of thinking about it in Jefferson County. And I can show you the research if you'd like me to, and everything else that we sort of pulled together, the individuals that we pulled together in the thinking of this to be able to produce what we have today. So if you guys have any questions as we go along, by all means, just sort of unmute. And I know that Kay and I have talked a bit about the blending together of two, cohorts, some that have been sort of with for a bit and some that are brand new. So there's going to be parts of this where it may feel old to those who have been, with us before, but I've got a new flair to it. We've got new information about things. But if you're brand new to this, we're talking about assessment. That's the third wheel, right, with curriculum and instruction. And these can get pretty heavy pretty quickly. And there's oftentimes a moment where you say, "My God, my God, my God," and that's not what we want to think about on a Saturday when the sun is shining. So, what I will say to you is what I say to my teachers is the standards implementation process is over a multi-year understanding, right? And so many of you guys have just gone through the very first element for the assessment with the field test. Jefferson County did not participate in that field test. I think there's like a total of like 6 counties that didn't do it. But I was one of the standards writer for the high school, as well as on the KDE/Pearson assessment team. I helped sort of do parts of the assessment. I've item reviewed all 500 items twice now with the new assessment. So I've actually seen all the questions. And this past summer, I spent some time with Pearson, Mia and another teacher who might actually be on here. With looking at what's known as range finding, which is when you look at an extended response and they're worth 4 points, what's a 0, what's a 1, what's a 2, 3, and 4, right? And so as we get into this idea of assessment, you also have to appreciate that as we do this, that there's 120 counties with how many ever schools that we have. Everyone has a different version of what assessment looks like. So please take this not as the gospel, but as one approach to it and how you might push back against it, how you might incorporate elements of it, or how you might be seeing it in a completely different way, right? So I just want to sort of put that at the very beginning of it. Don't think that Kay has brought me along to say this is the Jefferson County way. We would never say such a thing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going at this. And by all means, please just interrupt at any point. And Kay, if you don't mind to be the point person for the chat, I will respond that way. So, well, I hate that we can't be together in this in person. Sometimes these conversations around assessment specifically are a little bit better in person. But man, one of the best things is being able to be at home, right, when your kids are in the background and the dogs are barking, and you can just walk out right during a break to your own house is kind of nice. So one of the questions that we're going to look at today is how do I assess student work, right? And so this is both like, this is sort of reflective in a lot of ways of what we're trying to do. So I want to begin, and please unmic or put into the chat. I've got 3 questions just so I can sort of formatively see where you guys are in your thinking of this. So if you don't mind to either unmute or put in the chat, why do we assess? Why do we assess? I don't want you to respond immediately. I'll give you guys here, 30, 40 seconds in order to see this. Why do we assess? All right, so I see the chat's blowing up. Who wants to unmic and maybe say a few reasons of why? Why do you assess?
I will. We want to see if students learned. We want to see if our instruction was effective, see what we need to change in the future.
Okay, so what students learn, our instruction, and then any kind of changes that we need to make. Okay, thank you. Somebody else.
And don't be afraid to just unmic and say what you wrote in the chat. Or if you would prefer, Ryan, I can read those to you.
Yeah, we'll see if anybody else want to add something they maybe put in the chat or just their own thinking of it.
Assessment is just extremely important because what we think that our students are achieving or learning because we presented this amazing lesson. We always want them to get it, but without the true assessment, we don't know what they truly did, what the takeaway was.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Kate, do you mind to read a few? And I know there's a lot, so you can sort of skip down. This is active crew today.
To see what students have retained after instruction, to measure learning, to see how much students have learned and how much they comprehend. And we may do some pre-testing or assessment to see what they already know, to gauge student progress, to gauge ourselves and our instructional effectiveness. And I think I would add that so that we can make revisions to become more effective, to identify areas to reteach. And then someone said, because textbook companies need to get paid, and that probably is very true as well. And a lot of these I'm not reading just because they say much the same thing. So
okay, and whoever said that about the textbook company, you must be after my soul today. Okay, so let's take a look then, just sort of at some of these larger responses. So I think that we might agree then, based on what you guys said, is that one of the reasons why we assess has to do both with what the student is doing, right, and what the teacher is doing, right? That our assessments have to, reflect this much larger view of both us and them, right, as teacher and student. Okay, so let me ask you then this follow-up question here, right? As my dog, who's been quiet all day, begins to let me know that she's alive. How do we assess? Right, I'll give you guys here another 30 seconds. How do we assess? All right, so what say the group? How do we assess?
We assess summatively and formatively, and in multiple formats, multiple choice, extended response, performance activities.
Okay, formats, types, formative, summative, right? Measures of learning, measures for learning, right? In our approach to this. What else? People agree, disagree?
Sometimes just discussion with the children as the lesson is progressing, the banter going back and forth to see if they're even engaged in what you're doing is very important to know where you need to go next.
Okay, so this is another dynamic, right? This is part of that sort of formative understanding, right? That I think that we as teachers sort of own in our profession. The idea that as I'm talking to a person, I'm not just listening, right? I'm listening to what language they use, where they're coming from, right? These are all key elements, right, of understanding what our students know and where we might go with them, right? Okay, what did folks say in the chat? Did they say things that are similar, different?
Can I add one thing real quick?
Please do.
Well, and I also assess what they're not saying.
Okay, tell us.
What I'm not hearing, what I'm not seeing in their work, or those kinds of things.
That's good coming from a special education standpoint. The kiddos that don't understand are the ones that sit in the back of the classroom, or they try to make themselves as little as possible. So you won't call on them because they don't understand. They don't get the content.
Okay. Yeah, and please note that all roads ahead. Assessment is difficult. That's why nobody talks about it. The very thing that you just were talking about with students, it's the number one thing that teachers, administrators, the state, parents, right? Nobody wants to sort of dive into the problems of assessment. People would much rather talk about curriculum. They'd much rather talk about instruction. But you guys just sort of told me in the very first one, right? If we don't do this well, then we're never going to know what to do instructionally, right? The second part here, if we don't do this part well, what I'm hearing is that, well, by George, we're not even doing our jobs and we're not even listening to our kids, right? All right, let's look at this third question then. What do we assess? So I'll give you guys another 30 seconds here. Be thinking about this one. Okay, time. Who would like to unmic and unmute and tell us, what do we assess?
The standards, the concepts that we're teaching, the learning target for the day, whatever is our main goal that we want them to walk away with. Did we get the information to them? Did they understand it? Are they able to truly apply it?
Okay. Other folks who have something similar or different?
I really like this one that's in the chat where a couple of people have said skills and their ability to perform those skills, because that's a little bit, I see a lot of the standards, but I think that the skill is representative of the standards.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, Kay, because that's really going to be a lot that we talk about today, right? Is when we're looking at why we assess, how we assess, and what do we assess, assessing information is really easy. And the person who was after my heart earlier about textbooks, textbook companies and the way we do assessments have made it very easy to do multiple choice. It is the absolute cheapest way to find out the most amount about how kids have retained information, right? It's the cheapest way. But when it comes to, say, writing, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today, man, oh man, it's very difficult to understand what kids know, how they're applying it, what they're bringing, what type of information they're bringing to the table, what concepts, whatever it is that we're giving kids, are they able to sort of reconstitute these thinking and be able to sort of show their stuff, right? Which means then that we also have to be building assessments, right? The how, right? We've got to build assessments that they're also looking at the skill, right? How do we assess skill? So for example, we've got a basketball player, right? How would I assess, right, this, or what would I assess, right? Or even why would I assess this basketball player? Like, how or what or why, and it can go anywhere you guys want to go with this, would you assess this basketball player? If you were their coach, right? How would you assess them to improve their skill, right? Or improve their game, right? What are some of the things that we might look at? And this one's really more for like an open, unmute and let's talk.
As a coach, you wanna win, so you're going to be looking at strengths and weaknesses as he's approaching the hoop. What was his stance? How did he jump? When did he jump? How did he hold his hands? What kind of power did he put behind the ball? Was it enough? Was it too much? And those kind of things that you could talk to him about to try to get him to improve, because ultimately we want to win the game.
Okay, so we want to win the game, so we've got to be able to assess in certain ways, but it's not even just about like being able to say it. It's also how that coach might say some of those things, right? Those who've played sports here before, we all remember the coaches who were absolute jerks to us, who would just say things in such a biting way. And somehow our community has just got along with that, right? Like it was okay just to scream at little kids. But it doesn't necessarily help those little kids, does it? Right? Like, oh, you didn't make the basket, or you didn't have your elbow in a certain place, right? Or you threw it too hard, right? Let me ask you this then as a follow-up. To what degree can this athlete assess their own ability? Because I'm sure the athlete wants to win too, right? So how do they self-assess in the same scenario? Are they on the same page as their coach? I know I've asked a lot of questions here, right? But to what degree can they self-assess on the exact same things that were just mentioned?
Film session.
Go ahead.
During film session.
Okay, during film session, they might be able to they're reflecting on what happened, but during the game, can they assess sort of what's happening?
The best ones can on the fly.
Okay. So to what degree then is the coach and the athlete in agreement about what's being assessed?
I think that they probably should be in agreement, because if the coach knows what if the coach has given the player the suggestions he needs to change his game to make it better, then the player should be able to see if that's happening during the game based on his performance. if he's making the shots, if he's getting the ball, doing the defense stuff. So they should be in agreement.
Okay, so they should. So I think Kimberly's had it right here, right? I think that we should, and you guys are all over this too, right? That there should be some agreement when it comes to the assessment of an athlete. What is expected from the coach's point of view, who is an expert in that field, but also to what the student, whatever the athletes are able to give to that coach, right? Like if the coach were to say, hey, you know, like you're not following through with your shot, the athlete is not going to be like, what are you talking about? You've never mentioned that before. Or if it's like, you know, you're charging too much into the lane and it's like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense to me, right? That there's some level of shared understanding of assessment. Okay, so this is Super Chef. This is a place in Louisville here, so pardon the local references. How would we assess, like, why would we assess, how do we assess, what would we assess a chef?
How the food tastes in the end. We may watch the procedure if they hold the knife correctly.
Yeah, it sort of depends on if I'm another chef who's coming in, right? Or if I'm, I guess the audience might matter, right? Because I could be assessing this person as another chef. I could be assessing this person as a health inspector. I could be assessing this person as a patron, right? To your earlier element.
Timeliness of the meal.
Okay.
Do we get it on time?
So that's a different kind of skill, right? Like, how long does it take to make a certain meal that's on the menu? And how long does that take whenever, you know, you've got 8 people at your table versus a Friday night with 8 people at your table, right? And how do I still get that meal very hot, right? How can I work my magic and that skill development in that same time? Okay, all right. Let's do one more. How about how would we assess this? How would other people know of our feelings about this?
The way you respond whenever you take your first bite, are you enjoying the food? Was it, like you said, was it warm whenever it came to the table? What did they cook it to my specifications? Those kind of things. So did I send it back to the kitchen and say, this is not what I ordered. This was not how I asked for it.
Okay. Yeah, for all those former servers like myself, you always try to position yourself on that second bite. Right when that second bite is in their mouth, you want to come by and ask, how good is it? So the person can't even say anything to you. They just nod their head in agreement, right? That's what we want. That's all servers out there recognize that. We could also even assess them by a review, right? We could go online, we could put on Facebook, we could do other things. This was great. And we say the reasons why it's great, right? And we all know that we won't count Amazon in that because they sort of, give off those gift cards to make sure everybody gets a 5-star review, right? How about this one? A little bit more difficult. How would we assess John Lewis in his effectiveness of giving a speech in 1963? Oftentimes overshadowed by King's speech here. Why, how, and what are we assessing when it comes to John Lewis's speech?
Sometimes as teachers, we are, from the administrator's point of view or central office, we are compared to other teachers. So sometimes the newer teachers in the building are expected or criticized for not living up to the standards that maybe the veteran teacher is, or vice versa. Sometimes you've got veteran teachers that have been at it 25 years and we're coming to the end of our career and maybe not got as much wind in ourselves we used to have, and then they're comparing us to the one straight out of college that's doing all the new technology. So it depends on which way you're looking at it. You could be compared. It could be a good thing, and it could be useful of putting those two together to see, learn from the ones that have been there for a while versus, and also learn from the ones coming straight out of the universities. Okay. So it's being overshadowed either way. Okay.
Interesting take on this one. Don't disagree, just an interesting take.
Things in the chat. What is memorable of the speech? What impact or effect did it have on the listeners? Did it affect change? And then also the audience feeling connected to the message.
So then, based upon that, we would have to figure out, we'd have to be able to measure the impact, right? We'd have to be able to measure, and when are we measuring that impact? Is it like an immediate impact? Would it be like over like a 5-year process? right? Is that impact still being felt today, right? Right, as an element. And then finally, right, one that we're going to talk about a lot today is, well, okay, look at the skill, the knowledge, the disposition, the understanding of the messiness of the three that came before this, and recognize that writing is infinitely more difficult to assess. How do we know if a kid knows something because of the 50 to 150 to 300 words that they use, right? That becomes the difficult element. It is no longer a world of just saying like, okay, well, you got number 5 wrong, and never mind why you may have gotten number 5 wrong, right? Maybe you read the question too quickly. Maybe the answer choices, maybe it just wasn't worded properly. Maybe multiple choice are the only assessments I know of, wherein a person who knows nothing can get it right, and a person who knows something about it can get it wrong. But writing seems to be a place where it actually says a lot. But we all know that, especially in social studies, and maybe the English folks here, that BS can, just come right into our understanding of what kids are throwing down on a page, right? The word vomit they might give us at times. And what do we do about it? How do we actually improve that? Because it's not going to be as easy, right, as being able to say, look, physics demands that if you shoot a basketball this way, right, then it's going to go in the hoop, right? Or the idea that there's a clear procedure for holding a knife over time that has been done in a certain way. Or that a certain speech with a certain rhetoric at a certain time, right, could be impactful. This is like, how do we help a kid on a Tuesday morning where it's raining outside during COVID, right? That's sort of where we are in looking at this larger bit of assessment. So hopefully that sort of made some sense. Any thoughts, reactions to looking at assessment in this why, how, and what kind of way? And hopefully my goal of this is to start to get under your skin a touch, right? So we can start to deconstruct how it is that we assess students, what it is that we're assessing, and why it is that we go about assessing them. Any thoughts, questions, concerns so far? Okay. This is a released item, right? You guys have probably seen this before with the with the test. This is actually from the high school, right? How are people and places affected by rapid migration? And we can see that we've got a lot of the standards, right? This is one thing about what's being assessed. And it's construct an argument to answer the compelling question, right? How are people and places affected by rapid migration? Use what you have learned about the reciprocal relationship between the physical environment and culture, and text us to answer. Right? Use multiple sources to develop a claim in your response. Sources may include the introduction. Write at least 2 paragraphs.
So Ryan,
yeah, go
Ryan,
ahead.
Question in the chat about where can they find these released items?
Oh, perfect. Yep. Well, I can show you exactly where we have them. Let me, whoops, you don't need to see that or that. You can see this. So under, and I can put this into because I don't exactly know where they are currently, because we just pulled them into our website. And so on our standards part here.
I think Kate put the link to Pearson in the chat, and I will add that to both of the active agendas.
I was gonna say that's where this is. Yeah, the Pearson practice exam. They've only got about 10 for 5th grade, 10 questions for middle, and 10 for 8th grade, and 10 for 11th. But this is typically where we have the practice. And this is, by the way, just a slideshow that we put together for our department chairs, principals, and so on. You guys are welcome to it if you want it there. Okay, so this is a released item, right? And we can see that, man, oh man, what are kids being asked to do here, right? Well, they're being asked to pull from multiple sources, which means that the skills involved with that is going to be not only being able to read those multiple sources, right, in a content literacy way, but in a disciplinary way, where they're going to corroborate evidence across those multiple sources. In order to construct a claim, okay, we got to talk about what a claim is, right? So being able to synthesize that down into a cogent statement that takes a position, right? And that position has to be, here's another layer of this, right? It has to be a position that answers directly a question, but not just answering a question, it has to be a very pointed question about this reciprocal relationship between physical environment and culture. So we're seeing then that the requirements of kids here to be able to do this is quite demanding. And for those elementary folks, this is no different. This is almost verbatim how those fifth grade assessment looks, right? So this is that moment where there could be an oh God, oh God, oh God kind of moment, right, in the situation. And we actually have then, it took a while for them to release it, much to my anger, a rubric. This is the rubric that's being used. And I'm going to give you just a moment here to take in this. I'm going to go ahead and reveal my bias. What I think may be one of the worst rubrics I've ever seen in my entire life, right? And I say that with me being on record, because I've already told Pearson about how I think about this, right? It's very problematic, and I'm happy to explain those problems, right? But if you know what, I'm 100% open mind. If I can be convinced otherwise, then let's hear it. But I want to give you guys a second here to look at this.
And Ryan, I want to say one thing real quickly that we've talked about before, but I want to repeat it, is that in reading that question, you can see how very, very important it is to use the language of inquiry in your teaching, because it refers to compelling questions. It's going to refer to that language on the test. So your kids have to know that language.
Kay, I'm glad you pointed it out. That's probably the biggest takeaway of any time that I speak, right? The language is going to appear in the prompt. The language is going to appear in the answer choices. The language of the standards is going to be key. However, please don't turn that language into a vocabulary test, right? Talking about cultural diffusion, a kid might be able to define it, but if they can't apply it to a source in the past and a source in the present, then they don't understand that term. And having to memorize that term is not going to be helpful, right? And we can talk about that, Kay and group here as we go through. All right, so what do you guys notice here about this rubric? Am I accurate? Anybody want to defend this rubric? What do you notice?
So in the chat there's some language in there that is not necessarily defined appropriately. Like, what is efficient? What is sophisticated? What is appropriate? What's in depth?
So I want you to imagine then, for the athletes on the call, the former or current athletes on the call, right, or former or current musicians on the call. I want you to imagine I'm your coach, and I say to you after you shoot a ball, I say, that was not an efficient process. Right? I want you to think about, like, if you're playing an instrument and I look at you afterwards and you say, hey, I'm paying you all this money to improve my ability. And I say, that wasn't really an appropriate use of an extension. What's the issue here?
It's lack of clarity.
Yeah. Even though it says a clear communication of ideas, that's probably the most clear, ironically, of all this list. And we see that it actually continues down that element, right? And this is actually what myself and several other teachers were charged with doing, is trying to figure out, well, when students give a response, this is actually the rubric that KDE uses to judge our kids.
And someone has put in the chat, very open to interpretation. And you know what makes me think of is back when we used to do the portfolios, and they had to have those where you had to align and you had to read those things and be able to use the rubric appropriately. And it almost looks like they need to do something like this if it's going to be this open to interpretation, as Monty says.
And look, let me defend this rubric now, right? We want a rubric when it comes to writing that gives us enough space to where kids can, on a question like this, take multiple viewpoints. Prior assessments were about funneling students down to a common answer, right? And this is oftentimes what teachers think assessment should be, is that everybody should leave that class knowing the exact same thing and expressing it in the exact same way. Inquiry relieves us of that burden, right? It allows us to see that kids can be at multiple levels, right? That there could be multiple interpretations, and that a kid using source 1 and 2 to prove their claim might be different altogether, right, than a kid who uses source 3 and 4 to prove that claim. So there has to be enough space inside of a rubric that allows for, right, you guys sort of see what I'm saying here, right? There's a certain level of specificity, but also a certain openness, right, to do that. And oftentimes, Pearson, whenever they do a rubric like this, just so you guys don't panic on me, on this. They do underneath this, and you can see this from the released items, right? They do give a whole listing of things that say students may include these things, and they break it down so that everybody can see some of the possibilities. But even then, after a page or two listing of things that might be included, they just say there could be other things too. Let me ask you a question again. Who is this rubric for? What is the function of this rubric? And I'll help out even more. Is this for teachers? Is this for Pearson? Is this for students?
In general, rubrics are for students and teachers.
That's right. So Jessica has this sort of saying, yeah, we want to make sure that just like before, right? We talked about this with the basketball player, right? The coach and the player should be kind of on the same page with the goal in mind, right? The goal in mind here, not being to win a basketball game, but for young people to accurately communicate their conclusions based upon evidence inside a certain context of disciplinary thought, right? We should be sort of on the same page. Let me ask you this, Jessica, right? Put you on the spot. Would you use this rubric with your students?
I'm still muted. I think it's a little too vague. It needs to be a little bit more specific if I want them to see exactly what I want them to do.
That's right. And then let me ask you this, Jessica, again, as a follow-up, right? Sorry, Jessica, you're on the spot. I apologize.
Okay.
Would you then also, let's think about this, that let's say you're teaching in a PLC. Would your PLC partner and you have the exact same understanding of appropriate use of insightful interpretations?
Would they have the exact understanding? No.
Okay.
Because insight is not always the same.
That's right. Right. So now we've got a situation where I know that Kay, you're part of your crew here. If they haven't already, we'll eventually be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a situation where if a rubric is not calibrated about what's the expectation measure, then you're setting up for an unequitable scenario wherein a kid's grade is not necessarily determined by what they know and can improve, but which class they're in, right? So kid A is in my class, they get an A on this based upon the same rubric that Jessica's using in class B, where if that student was in there, they would have gotten for the exact same response a B, right? That becomes a problem, doesn't it? So I want to add another layer to this. I want you to imagine me as a parent if you were to use this rubric, okay? This is also the reason why I can't speak at, my wife doesn't let me speak at parent-teacher conferences, which are coming up on Monday. Imagine that you circle on a rubric that my kid gets a 3, right? And I come into you and I say, okay, my daughter Penelope, she's gotten a 3 on this assessment. Can you explain to me why that, like, I'm looking at the rubric and I'm like, okay, so can you show me where like she overlooked or had a misunderstanding, or why she didn't use an appropriate use of more efficient or sophisticated processes in her answer, right? Can you give me that definition, right? And now all of a sudden, right, you have a nightmare scenario where you're caught not being able to figure out multiple things with a parent like myself, who's going to be quite angry if it's a response where, well, you know, I've been grading for a long time, or, well, you know, we've done this before, and, you know, your daughter's doing well, and, you know, oh, I can relook at that, right? I've been in these same scenarios, right? I'm not trying to call anybody out here. I'm looking at younger Ryan, right, in this scenario. Because ultimately what's going to happen is that my next response is going to be, how does any of this help my kid move forward? How is it that you're actually able to not just know where they are, but how can this rubric be leveraged to move my child forward so I can reinforce those things at home, right? And this is probably where I find the rubric most in dire need of something, right? That it doesn't establish these very clear understandings, right, of what I can do to not only understand what my kid knows, but also how I can improve my kid, right? This, by the way, I'm going to give you guys a second here. I want you guys to apply this. I want you to apply this rubric to what the state actually gives you. This is to them an example written by adults, not by children, as an exemplar of this released item. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys here, and I want you guys to score this. I want you guys to tell me why you would even give it a 4. Tell you what, this is going to be a 4. I want you to tell me with this rubric why it's a 4, right? And why it's not a 3, right? Because that's where the line is on this. Why is this a 4 and not a 3? Because this is the exemplar. This is like the best case scenario for this. So I'll give you guys here a couple minutes to sort of just lean into this one a little bit.
Ryan, we have a question, and the question is there a definitive reason?
About why this is a 4?
Right.
No.
Also in the chat, I'm thinking they were ultimately impressed by clear articulation of vocabulary usage and sentence structure mechanics.
Okay, then I would say, what part of the rubric would you put that under? Would that be under clear communication? Would that be the relevant concepts? Is good mechanics as a writer, is that an efficient process?
So we've got some other things in the chat. It doesn't appear that they are overlooking or showing misunderstanding of some details. However, I still say this is too ambiguous. I'm not seeing any in-depth understanding, however. Their observations are very surface level. Someone else says completion of 2 paragraphs, clear communication of ideas. Now, can I say something? I was the language arts teacher who gave a student a C on a paper, and the parent argued with me because she said, but she has won awards in writing. And I said, she writes beautifully, but it doesn't say anything. It has to communicate a message. And it doesn't matter how pretty the writing is if it doesn't say anything, is my point.
Yeah, because you can actually be clear communication of ideas all the way down to a 2. That doesn't mean that this is a 4, right?
So someone says, it's not insightful, got to get rid of the fluff, depth matters.
Okay, so to that
Can I
person,
see the prompt again? I'm sorry.
yeah, absolutely. Let me go back here. Whoops. Right. So when somebody says to get rid of the fluff, right? I'm not in disagreement. I would say, what part is fluff?
That was me, Ryan. This is Jill. And I stem from because I score AP Human Geography exams a lot. Yep. And some of the things that when I taught AP Human is that we say, just answer the question, just complete the prompt. What is it asking you to say? Is it saying, why is the sky blue? Well, tell me why the sky is blue. Don't explain to me, I don't need to know why how many birds are flying in the sky or what airplanes go over or how big the clouds are. Tell me why the sky is blue. Now, if I tell you to do a creative writing piece, please add everything else involved into it. But when it's straight, just tell me what I'm asking you. And that's they deal a lot with the AP exams, especially because human geo tends to be with freshmen, 14 and 15-year-olds, and they get out of having an English class where they can expand and expound to be a little bit fluffier, or, they're stuck in middle school where they want to add all this stuff. And they, as Kay said, they're saying a lot of things, but saying nothing at all. It's that song. I forget what it is right on the top of my head now that I said it, but I mean, it's just like you're saying, you keep going, quit circling the wagons on the, just sit down by the fire, start talking. So that's what I mean by that.
And Jill, that I appreciate your clarification, right? And as a former scorer for AP World, it was the same thing, right? In fact, instead of saying just answer the question, mine was just answer the blank question, right? Because that was something that students had a hard time doing, right? They want to dance all around it, but one of the things that we're trying to do here would be like, just put the ball in the hole, right? Just say the words for the speech. Just, cook the food, right? Just answer the question, right? But then there's so many degrees to that, right? There's so many different variations, except for putting the ball in the hoop, although I guess you could do granny style versus whatever the other one's called, right? And I don't mean any disrespect to any grannies in the world of looking at it. But this becomes problematic, right? Of like looking at this, because I think, part of seeing this assessment and part of especially this prompt, and Jill, I'm glad that you returned us back to it, When you see this, it becomes very, very intimidating. This assessment is very intimidating. In fact, if anybody here is seeing this for the first time, and now in your head, you're going, my God, this is what kids are going to get in 2 months. Yeah, this is. This is actually on the field test, right? I actually reviewed this question, right? And student responses to it. I've actually already calibrated it. Right?
They also have that part at and it was on the other page, but it talked about insightful interpretation. And it talks about analogies. And that, to me, as a language arts teacher, is it's not just answering the question. It is going a little bit beyond that, because it's asking you to be insightful and use analogies and compare it or something. So that's a little bit more than just answering why the sky is blue.
So I would then guess that if we have 35 folks on the call, if we were to score this, we would get 35 different responses, some of which are similar, but many of which the reasonings for we gave that would be different. And so we've got a conundrum.
So in the chat, Roger says he tells his students to treat him as if he is a younger child with a large vocabulary. Tell me simply, don't overcomplicate it. And then we've got a couple of people who are like, this looks tough. When I look at this, I want to get a new job. So
Stay with
that's
me.
why we're here, so that you don't have to get a new job. So
that's exactly right. Stay with me on this, because
Yeah.
again, you guys have already explained. I mean, you guys did such a great job, and I apologize for that trap, right? That I put you guys in about the why, the how, and the what of assessment. And you guys have all said, I can't do my job if I don't assess well, and kids can't learn if we don't assess well, right? So this is one that we're going to figure out, right, in a larger way. And I'm not here to shame anybody. I'm here to recognize and put on the table. Assessment's really, really hard to do, right? Actually, I take it back. Assessment's really easy to do, right? It's really hard to do well, right? To where you're building up trust in what's happening. So part of this, the goal of this is just to get everybody sort of to see the same issues here that a lot of us are seeing when it comes to what we got: three components, four components: the setup, right? The skills and knowledge involved there, the response, the skills and knowledge there, the rubric, how we're looking at the skills and knowledge, and an exemplar that is supposed to show those skills and knowledge. Right. So this is where assessment dominated my life as a teacher. If it's the one way in which I can see what my kids know and be able to do, and it's the one thing I can do to improve my practice specifically for those kids that I'm servicing in that moment, then I got to think a lot about assessment. Right. And so our job today is to try to figure out how can we make what seems to be perhaps the ceiling, the floor. Right. Okay, so this is as we're getting into this. These are some, again, ways in which we're thinking about it in Jefferson County about scaffolding up to be able to write a claim. Is something that we're not going to talk about a lot today, but something that I encourage you to start to look at. These are some other sessions that we've had, and if those folks who are new or here want to see those sessions, then please talk to Kay, and we can arrange some of that.
Let me know. Email me.
Yep. But we had this idea that a formative performance task in the social studies is the next sort of step to that of helping answer a supporting or even perhaps a compelling question is a claim or counterclaim, right? A position that you're going to take on something. But in order to be able to write better claims and counterclaims, well, you have to be able to explain things well, right? Maybe explain your reasoning, explain connections, but to show some kind of causal relationship between what you're doing. But before we can actually do good explanations, we have to have some kind of generalization, right? The idea that you have to be able to say things like the Cold War and have an understanding of that, what that might be, right? Or during Reconstruction, that's a generalization, right? Or if you're talking about the institution of enslavement, that's a generalization, right? Of these larger things. In fact, even saying something like a reciprocal relationship between people and land, we're generalizing about this, right? And that we can't do that at all until you can actually describe what you see, right? You can't, if you can't describe, I don't know, what the land looks like, desert, river, need for electricity, whatever the case might be, then you can't create those generalizations, which then means you can't use them to give explanations, and then you certainly can't take a claim on it. So this is one of the ways in which we go about assessing, at least here. And just so you guys know, description, explanation, and claim, counterclaim, all of those are specifically mentioned in the standards as a way of showing, using, applying those concepts and practices. Generalizations, we added in because it was just missing, right? And you actually can see that they actually talk about generalizations in the rubric, right? Which is really interesting and I think super important. But when it comes to evaluating, and again, we're just sort of looking at claims today, right? And maybe actually a generalization in a second. One of the things that I would recommend, right, moving away from, right, is that rubric from the state. And actually something maybe I was bold or arrogant enough to ask Pearson to do is to actually adopt these 4, right? These can be traced back to a lot of the work that I've done with Kathy Swan, that Chauncey Montesano has done at the University of Michigan. She's from the sort of the Weinberg group, right? This is what you're going to see a lot from people like Jeffrey Noakes or people like Van Sledwright. But the idea of like what we're trying to do when it comes to really ratchet down as what tightly as we can, but enough room as we can, these 4 criteria, right? Is something accurate? Is it clear? Is it evidenced? Is it reasoned, right? And this, for those folks who are using CER, should look pretty familiar, right? And that if you're looking at the the using evidence standards, if you're looking at the communicating conclusion standards, these are all parts of what we want to see. And just so you know, isn't too far off from this, right? But it's going to be more specific as I show you in just a second, right? So is it accurate? Is it clear? Is it evidence and it reasoned? And in our time remaining today, we will also even look at how we've used these buckets as a way of moving into standards-based grading, right? It'll be a shorter conversation, but it'll be there just so you know. And I've already met with some folks. I don't think James is here, James Botts, but I've met with him and I can't remember if Angie, you and I talked about this, but just as an FYI. So any quick questions about these terms before we get into the next piece of where they might come from? And again, obviously they're problematic. I'm going to show you exactly what we mean by accurate, clear, evidence, and reason, right? But even that is in itself problematic. And then we're going to get into that piece too. Any quick questions? Okay. So this is actually the rubric that we're using here in Jefferson County as a way of not only assessing where kids are, but to be able to move them forward in their writing. So let me be very clear about that. We're not just, this isn't just circling, right, a number on a page. This is about that type of information gives what's known as quantitative feedback, right? This kid gets a 3, this kid gets a 3.5, whatever that means. This kid's going to get a 4, this kid's going to get a 2. And then overall, I can sort of see quantitatively where my kids are. So I want you to imagine then you're a coach for the UK basketball team, and you assign players as they run off the field that day, right? Run off the field, geez, oh, Ryan. Run off the court that day. And you say, okay, player 1, you are an 8 out of 10 today, and you're a 7 out of 10, and you're a 6 out of 10. Tell me how good that's going to be, right? And then you go into, your Calipari, you go into a press conference, and you say, look, our class, our average athlete today had a 7.5. I feel very good about that. And then you just sort of end there, right? That might be good enough for whoever is designing that, a quantitative understanding of it, but it doesn't actually give me anything that I can use to move that student forward or to grow that student, right? What's worse is oftentimes giving that kid, right, a circled, 1, 2, 3, whatever the case is, it actually burdens that kid on their own improvement. It doesn't actually mean that we as teachers are going to move them forward, right? And so one of the things that I recommend as a way of bridging that gap is to use what's known as a single point rubric. And that's what you're seeing here. We don't play around. There's no reason. I mean, we spent all summer, or four days of my 15 days that I get off in the summer. I spent 4 days looking at this rubric and trying to parse out, well, where does a 3 become a 4? Where does a 2 become a 3? And what's more, what does a low 3 look like, a medium 3, and a high 3? Because we had to do that as well, right? That way we're giving these larger ranges. Why in the world would I ever want to do any of that? What I want to do is get the kids exactly that criteria in the center here is exactly what I expect. 100%. The question is, how is it being detracted from and how can I enhance it? Or sorry, what is being enhanced by that claim, right? Now we're going to use this rubric today, right? And if you see value in it, great. I can talk to you more about it. If you don't see any value in it, well, you saw what you don't want to do in the future. So let's sort of break this down. So I want to sort of be super clear with this as we go through. What you're seeing is a single point, meaning that instead of a 1, 2, 3, or 4-point rubric, we've removed all the other points on that. And this criteria in the center is the single point of where we want kids to be. That when we mention accurate, what we mean by that is that disciplinary information is factual and relevant to the inquiry, right? Jill said earlier that birds in the blue sky could represent what we see when we look up, but it is not relevant to the question being asked, right? And we see relevant being used quite a bit in the standards. That's why we put this in here, right? By clear, we mean language is organized, disciplinary specific, and constructed for an intended audience that is relevant to the inquiry, right? So you might be able to have, like lower speech or whatever, which might be fine for their peers. But if, earlier it was said, you're writing from me who is a younger version of you, but who has a good vocabulary, right? That's an intended audience of what we need to know, but it still needs to be relevant, right? When we talk about evidence, we mean that evidence is sourced, contextualized, corroborated, and cited from credible sources with multiple perspectives that, guess what, are relevant to the inquiry. And then when we talk about reasoning, we mean that your analysis connects evidence to conclusions through disciplinary thinking, logical interpretations, and multiple perspectives that are relevant to the inquiry. So what we've tried to do in this, right, is to give, and again, as you're going to see as we move through this, this language, there's going to be, we need to talk about, right, the next piece. I'll get to the next piece in a second, right? But this is sort of where we are, right? Accurate, clear, evidenced, and reasoned. What I want to sort of then show off here is that not every student, you'll notice over on the side here, right? And this is just so you guys know, this is just getting used to the, right, what you're seeing. So you'll understand how to use it in a second. What you're seeing over here is that there's a scaffold to this. I used to be a track and cross country coach. You would probably think that if you had a kid who ran from me, it might be irresponsible of me if the kid cannot run an 800 meter, which is a half mile, I should probably not put them in the mile. That should be pretty logical, right? So if I don't scaffold that kid up, I'm going to both make him hate me, lose faith in me, have the parent be upset at me, and maybe even watch them walk across the track, which is just bad, right? And oftentimes the rubrics we use with students, right? And I want you to just internally think about this. A lot of the rubrics that we use with students, we already know that many of our students are not going to be successful on them. But we just give the entirety of the thing because that seems to be equitable, but it's not, right? If I already know that a kid is not going to do well in a certain part of the rubric, why in the world would I set that kid up for failure? Right? That's not going to help anything. That's not going to answer my why, my how, or my what when it comes to assessment. So what we're actually advocating is that you scaffold up students to be able to meet those expectations over time. If a student is not able to be accurate with the information they provide in writing, I don't care how clear, evidenced, or reasoned it is. It is not accurate. It is now wrong in every sense that it could be, right? So if this could be a good place where you're starting to think about your students and saying, look, I'm working with Johnny over here. Johnny is really struggling with his writing, right? You guys have already mentioned this. How do I get a kid who's on a 5th grade reading level in 11th grade to be able to write whenever his writing level is actually below his reading level? Well, you don't do it by handing him the entire rubric and then punishing for the writing, because that kid's going to think that they're a bad writer and they're never going to want to write again. So when they see an assessment like you saw earlier, that kid is going to instantly shut down and just click on to the next thing, right? We don't want that, right? So the idea here is that you would scaffold these down to where you might be able to provide just this first one for some students. So Johnny could be just on scaffold 1 in a class. Theoretically, then I could be on scaffold 2 and Kay could be on scaffold 3, right? So you can actually build this up, Or you could just be looking at scaffold 2 and scaffold 4, right? It doesn't have to be all of them. I could just be looking at my communicated conclusions. So I wanted you guys to see that this rubric allows for a lot of movement of being able to be there both for the teacher to assess how good of they're doing at their job, but also being able to teach kids this language so that they know where they are in that self-assessment in the same way we talked about an athlete knowing and being on the same page as their coach. If that doesn't have a disconnect, then those kids are never going to take whatever you give them and improve. They will not know how to, which is why then, right, we provide these areas to give that individualized feedback to the student. At the beginning of a year, a student may not know what discipline-specific language is. Guess what? We have a lot of time to be able to show them in writing and be able to actually put, hey, over here in a detractor, right, which is sort of the areas they need to really work on, right? Over here, your language is unclear, right? You're using you're using words like stuff and things and many and very. And this vague language is taking away from your inquiry. Or let's say that a kid over here on this side says, wow, you just use cultural diffusion in your claim. This is an excellent example of disciplinary specific language, which you then connected, right, through reasoning, right? So you're actually able to point out to the student, not only the areas in which they need to work, but also the areas in which they are just knocking out of the park, right? And then of course, if you wanted to, if they're right on it, I just wrote right on, right where you need to be, right? Because I'm grading 150 of these things, okay? And we've got some hyperlinks terms in there in a second. So I'm just going to pause for a moment here to let you guys ask any questions about this, because we're gonna actually use this in some writing in just a second.
One of the things I love that you said was that your students could be at different places on this. And so that's especially essential to teachers who may have gifted students or special needs students or students that are slower. You can give it to them in a way that is meaningful and still helps them to grow.
Okay.
And Julie says she likes the feedback spaces. And I do think you could put something that's a detractor, but also an enhancer. And then the kid doesn't feel like they just didn't do well.
That's right. Yeah, actually, that actually happened a lot, Kay, is that because I use this in my classroom. I told my wife this morning when I moved here from Boyle, I lost so much of my stuff, right? Google at the time could not transfer over as easily as it can now to new accounts. And I lost, one of the folders I lost was all my student work on this, right? So I could show you exactly, right, how I actually did this in a class. Not that you guys would want to follow my example 100% or maybe at all, but at least I could show you more about what this is. But we're actually going to do some of these to say, okay, you've done something when it comes to accuracy that's a detractor, but in the next sentence, you actually did something that's really well. What Kay and I think, are both getting at here is that there is one way in which you can improve a child, and it's by leveraging what they've already done well, right? If you were to say to a child whenever they're writing, hey, see how this first claim, you did this, this, and this? Look in the second claim, you did not do any of those things. How could we then take the second claim, which is found wanting, right, and to recondition it in a way that you've already proven yourself, right, as an element? And that's something that I actually did quite a bit. The other beauty of this, by the way, is I used to have a folder where my kids would store all of these after they were using it. So every time we would go to write, right, they could take these out, right? Or there were times where parent-teacher conferences would come, and I could actually lay out, like, Jill, if I had your child, if you have a child, sorry, I used a fake example there. But if I used my own child, I'll use that. I could actually see the growth over time of where I put for detractors and enhancers, which allows me to do the one thing that human beings are really good at, which is recognizing patterns, right? What is the pattern here, so I can really individualize that feedback to kids? That's how you build a relationship with students, through assessment, right? And also get them to value that assessment. It also is what gives a lot of confidence, right, in parents when they're talking to their teacher about why or how their student is struggling, right? I could literally just lay these out as I did for Menti parents and say, look, At the beginning of the year, they were really struggling on these pieces. This is the exact feedback that I gave. They started to incorporate some of that feedback. We started to learn more about this. And by the end, some of them it's just all enhancers, right? Which is exactly what it should be, right? You can literally see it move across the page. Other thoughts, questions, concerns?
Nicole says she likes that it's simplified as a special ed teacher. She says this is great because it's simplified.
That's right. Yep, absolutely. Others?
This reminds me a lot of what I do with AP early in the year. Instead of saying, here's what a DBQ multiple choice looks like. Here's what a free response looks like. Here's what the long essay looks like. Here's what your full DBQ looks like. They would shut down and many of them drop the class within the first couple of days. But after period 1, we're looking at the multiple choice part. We're looking at the short answer part. During period 2, we start to incorporate the long essays, and we do one in class together where they can see the evidence. They can see their own detractors, the detractors of their peers, and look at the enhancers and try to pull from it. And then by period 4, we're starting to introduce the whole DBQ process as well. And then it just contextualizes it all together for them instead of trying to say, here you go, learn all this. We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Yeah, Joshua, what you're saying there is exactly what I did as well as an AP teacher, right? You sort of have to, right? Because, as anybody here knows, as AP, oftentimes AP was harder as a class than most of the college classes they're going to be taking. And they're taking it as like early on in their career, right? Jill was mentioning earlier about, AP Hug. And this becomes, sort of problematic, is that we want to see kids be successful. But oftentimes a way in which we assess it, because we don't get into the nitty gritty of that assessment, we just sort of assign a score and we move forward, right? And that can be very detrimental, especially when it comes to writing, is that my son has already identified himself as a bad reader. I mean, he's a second grader, which means you guys can sort of see where his educational was when it comes to COVID, right? It's like the absolute worst possible time. And he thinks he's a bad reader. Do you know now how, like, I have to, every time we go to read, reinforce this disposition that he's not a bad reader, right? As soon as a kid identifies themselves as a bad writer, it's the same thing. In fact, in a second, I'm going to have you guys write at least one thing here that we're going to assess as a whole team. And everybody now knowing that is going to get suddenly very antsy and worried that their writing could actually show up here, right? That could be problematic, right? But what we're trying to do is say, like, look, if you can't write if you can't write a clear sentence, then you can't write a clear paragraph, right? So let's just focus on one sentence at a time, right? In the same way Joshua was saying, look, if I give you all these, FRQ, SAQ, DBQ, acronym soup, then, you've got a scenario where the kid's going to shut down. And that's the last thing we want. Because right now we're seeing the greatest way of moving every kid forward. I love that the two folks who spoke said, man, this reminds me of AP. And this also reminds me of those who are receiving special ed services. That can sort of show you, right, the real range where something like this can be beneficial, but it's still not easy, right? So I don't want to be like, oh, here's the silver bullet. No such thing, right? No such thing. Other thoughts, questions? Okay. So this is the next step, right? Remember I said that, well, you might be saying, well, Ryan, look, you were super critical earlier of this sort of vague language. And then you just, okay, I get that there's now new boxes that are there, right? You've actually broken this down in a way where you can look at accuracy, clarity, evidence, and reason, which, by the way, is exactly what we want students to be talking about. In peer-to-peer, imagine this, imagine somebody walks in, right? You invite me to your class. I'd love to come to your all's classes if I could do that. And I'll walk in, I go into Jill's class or Joshua's class, and I overhear kids saying, look, Andrea, your claim here is just not accurate. I feel pretty good. I feel pretty good about what you're doing with your students. I also feel pretty good about our democracy too, that accuracy becomes such an important element of what's being talked about, right? Or I could imagine hearing this. Look, Andrea, who's my wife's name? You've sourced this bit of evidence, but you haven't contextualized it, right? And it doesn't make any sense that way. Man, if we just heard that language, holy moly, wouldn't that be awesome? And the reason I bring this up is that a lot of the language that you see here in this criteria comes directly from the standards. And we did that intentionally so that students are metacognitively thinking about what that criteria is So whenever, like a term like corroborated is going to show up on the assessment. Okay, it's in the standards, especially middle school, right? But it'll also show up on the high school as well. I think actually even, I had to double check. It'll show up differently in 5th grade. But if kids aren't using this term all the time, then they're not going to know what to do. They're not going to be able to have that skill. They're not going to have that terminology that we want. So when Kay was mentioning earlier about the language of the standards, this is the language of the standards, right? That's also then redoubling as the very rubric you're using to help kids move forward. Mm-hmm. But even this can be problematic, right? And so one of the things that and I just went to a school this past week to talk about this, is that we've got to calibrate. And this is what's going back to that conversation earlier about, would we all agree on the same information, right? And we do this a lot. And I've done this actually with some of you guys before, where I actually ask you to write what a claim is, right? I ask you to write what an explanation is. And suddenly we've got all these different definitions of what a claim and explanation is. Well, that's not helpful, right? A claim in Mr. News class should be, it's kind of the same claim in Miss News class if they're both social studies, right? Now, if it's in science or another content area, that might shift a bit. That's fine, right? Because all those things require different things based upon their disciplinary information. But what we've done here is to try to figure out, okay, well, let's give more language to this so that we can calibrate around a rubric to provide more equitable feedback and equitable assessment of our students. It should not be based upon the class in which they attend or the teacher in which they have. It should be based upon the criteria that the school sets out as where their line in the sand is. So what we've done and what we work with some folks, and what I encourage you to do in your PLCs, either as a massive group like us or even back in your schools, is then breaking down what this language means. What do you mean by factual? What do you mean by relevant, right? Or for example, what do you mean by organized? What do you mean by discipline specific? What do you mean by constructed, right? And you can see why we did it this way, because if number one, doing it this way allows it to grow over time, right? If we put all of the things that you see there in the non-bolded inside the rubric, well, by George, whenever the kids see that, they're going to be overwhelmed. You mean I got to get academic vocabulary, mood, tense, voice, economic, like conventions, pronouns, like everything in the same way? That's going to be impossible. But it's something that can be folded in. For example, early on in the year, one of my points of weird contention is mood. All history claims should be written, right, in, what is it? What is the mood? Oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. I get so on to the other one. What I'm looking for is where it's not, which is in a subjunctive mood, meaning that it's using things like would. Would, for example, is like the worst possible thing, I think, that kids at a certain level could use. I know I'm being, this is me being very specific. I want to be very clear that this is like after the kids have other things, right, taken care of and what's going on. I don't just go straight to this one. But this is one later on where kids keep using the word would. This would have happened, this would happen. And they're using it as a, as a past tense, which is not accurate. Would is a subjunctive mood. It's a potential future, right? I would have gone to the store, but I got hit by a car. I didn't make it to the store. So you can't say things like that in history because they either happened or they didn't. There's even evidence or they did not happen, right? That's an extreme level that you might be able to get your kids to, right? And what's going on. Or for example, voice. We try to avoid, in social studies, we try to avoid, especially in history, passive voice versus active voice. These are known things to have happened, right? As an example, right? When it comes to credible, what do we mean by credible? Well, these are all things, again, that show up in the standards, right? Is it cited? Is there evidentiary limitations? That's actually a 7th grade standard, right? When we talk about credible. Relevant, again, we're defining relevant above under the accurate. Relevant here could mean something totally different inside of evidence, that the evidence used is relevant, that it's sequenced properly, right? And again, these are just examples, right, that you and your PLC can calibrate on. There's no way that the state is going to be able to calibrate on all these aspects, but a PLC should be able to do so. A school district should be able to do so, right? To make sure everybody's talking about the same language. And the final one here is the sort of disciplinary thinking, right? Okay, so when you're talking about logical interpretations of multiple perspectives, logical interpretation could be like a cause and effect, right? Are they showing a true cause and effect, or are they just showing correlation, right? This is getting them to think more disciplinarily about what cause and effect, which is a concept inside of our standards, is discussing, right? So I'm gonna leave it here for a second to see what you guys think about this, right? Tell me if this would be useful inside of your PLC to calibrate so that everybody's on the same page, right? When it comes to using this language. And again, note that you're not going to show up on that same day, right? Like if you go on Monday and say, by George, I was at this fantastic training on a sunny day. And this guy was going on and on and on about this rubric and how we need to calibrate around it. And I think that we should. Let's settle today once and for all what we mean by blank. It doesn't work that way, right? It can't work that way, right? This stuff has to move over time, and it has to be malleable to both that gifted kid, right, and the kid who needs extra services, right? And that you're allowing some of your students work to inform your calibration. Expecting them to write a certain way is the best way of killing kids' confidence and being, I think, in a lot of ways, an ineffective teacher. We can't come in saying this is what it needs to look like and then get everybody into that. In the same way that no coach in the right mind would say, you have to shoot this exact way every single time. Hey, coach, I can't get my elbow to do that. Doesn't matter. You got to do it the exact same way every time, right? No, as long as the ball gets in the hoop, that's fine, right? But that gets more complicated when it comes to writing. So I'm gonna pause just for a moment here to get some reactions, some feedback. And by the way, I'll also take anger and ire and anxiety. I'm fine with those two.
Ryan, I have a question. So this
Yep.
list of things that we're calibrating around that you've put on the side of the slide here, are those the things that are hyperlinked? Or
Only so the rubrics that we offer will have these underneath. Underneath
Gotcha.
our rubrics, yeah. So that way, we're moving towards that process. And in fact, Vincent, one of my colleagues, has put underneath it even where we're pulling from the using evidence, communicating inclusion standards, and so on, right? The hyperlink was a little bit different because we've had to add that layer of nuance onto it so that there's actually disciplinary thinking that's happening, right? And you'll notice here, by the way, if you look at this rubric versus this one, right? Once we get to that level, very different. I mean, there's not even anything here that even tells me this is social studies, like at all. Right? This is my number one frustration. This is exactly what I told Pearson.
go ahead. I was going to read what was in the chat.
Yep, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and read what's in the chat. What's up?
Okay, so Christine asked, doesn't this calibrated language have to be leveled to grade appropriate implementation? What a sixth grader finds as credible source will not be as advanced as what an eighth grader will find.
That's 100% correct. In fact, let me add another layer of nuance just to make this a little bit muddier. Your sixth grade students' understanding of relevant at the beginning of the year is going to be different than mid and then end of the year, right? That's another reason why we need to constantly be calibrating and recalibrating so that sixth grade teachers have a firm understanding of where their kids might be as they leave sixth grade, moving into seventh and on up to eighth, right? Too long has fifth, eighth, and 11th grade teachers borne the burden of trying to figure out the assessment, right? When we're talking about skill development, which is what we are here, right? It's going to take a lot of time. Like, I think about this a lot. Like this is what I thought about as a teacher. How many pieces of writing do I need to give to where my kids become comfortable with writing? But even that's fraught with, well, it depends on which part of the writing process I'm looking at, right? But no, what you raise is exactly the reason why, right? We need to make sure that we're talking so that, imagine this, imagine like 6th and 7th grade have like a really high expectation for this. They go over these rubrics and they get to 8th grade and that 8th grade teacher is not bought in. They don't understand what's going on. and they're assessing in a completely different way, those kids are now suddenly outpaced their teacher, and they're wondering why that teacher is even relevant to their daily understanding, right? Because that process of progression, of scaffolding has broken down to the point where the kids recognize it. And that's a very dangerous scenario to be in, right? If that makes sense. So yeah, so you're 100% there. That's why I encourage that instead of beginning with like, okay, boom, this is what I mean by relevant kids, you're explaining this as you go along, which means then that you as a practitioner, your understanding of all the conversations you're having with kids around relevant are informing you as the other teachers in your PLC have been informed by their students. So when you guys all come together as a PLC, you have not just a few minds working on this idea of relevant, you have hundreds of minds, right, that are working on relevant at hundreds of different abilities. And this is where the rubric process, as we began with, is both for teacher, right, and for student edification and growth. Other things in the chat? Or other thoughts here you guys have? Again, this is a lot to take in. I feel bad for the folks who are just entering in some of the conversation. This is a high level, nuanced conversation here to be looking into. It's not as simple, right? As I'm making it out to be. All right, I'm going to call on someone. Angie, Jill, what's on your minds?
Well, I have seen and used the single point rubric on numerous occasions. And, just echoing back a little bit of what you said earlier, it makes a real difference when you can give students something that they've actually done well. That really does help build on how much they'll do next for you, and how much effort they'll put in that. And so what I've also found is clear evidence reasoning, basically using, those very specific qualities makes it so much more pointed for students. Like you get a lot less of the, well, I'm not sure what to do type question, or I don't know what to do. And then when you say, well, what are you unsure about? They used to say, well, I don't know. I'm unsure about all of it. Or now, but they can say, well, I'm not sure what my evidence should be, or I'm not sure where my reasoning comes from, or those kinds of things. And so you can very specifically see kind of where they're off track. And that makes a big difference for my students. But the other thing too, I'm just sitting here because, Ryan, I've shared this with you a lot. Yeah. Like I know we're facing the test in a few months, and my students aren't ready. So, and even though every day we're doing as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, and I'm with you, right, on this. Being able to, I'm in a lot of classrooms and looking at this and trying to figure this out with teachers, right? What we see is that what these standards have done, right, has exposed an enormous gap in both student knowledge and ability and teacher knowledge and ability. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what assessment should do. That's what they're designed to do, right? The problem is that, we've suddenly found ourselves in a pandemic. We found ourselves with legislation that's bearing down upon us. We find ourselves trying to scramble to understand something that was never made clear to us to begin with. And we're trying to do it on the fly, right? And there's a lot of ways of disservice in that. And what I would say is that, I encourage you, and I think I've said this before, Angie, number one, you're probably helping your students out more than you could possibly know, right? Because they don't even know. They don't know any different, right? But you're seeing the full capacity of where they could go. And that's actually maybe weighing down and hampering or maybe clouding the ability to see the small micro changes you've already made or the major changes you've already made to get them ready. right? So I encourage you not to sell yourself short on that. But I also encourage that I'm also seeing what you mean by, I encourage you guys to think 3 years from now. Where are my students going to be in 3 years? Where are my PLCs going to be in 3 years? And especially those who are teaching, third or sixth or ninth grade on the call. You've got 3 years for your kids to move through that system to be able to get to that assessment, right? But these are also things that are part of our discipline. This is part of what we do. The problem is that it's not what we've done before. And if you find yourself 20 years in, you're in a very different state than if you're finding yourself 3 years in, right? Whenever you're looking at this. And those should be counted, right? As far as part of it.
Well, and I think the other thing, and you mentioned this as well, Ryan, like, the new standards became law in 2019, and that's then that spring in March, we were out of school for the rest of that year. And then, we've had the last, that last year, which was basically mostly all online. And then this year that has, although been in person, been so challenging. I don't know if I do know there are a few others who have expressed these same kind of things with, just reacclimating students to what education is and how we are trying to do it and those kinds of things. And so I think, being in the process since 2019, I guess I thought I would be a lot farther along by now, with the new standards. But I will tell you this, like I've learned so many little things that I've been able to implement, like actually deconstructing the standards with my students, particularly the inquiry standards, has been hugely important in, getting like them seeing mastery at the end of the unit. Also, deconstructing and staging the compelling questions. Like, I didn't do that really well at the beginning of the year. And then I realized when they got to the summative, like some of them didn't know what the compelling question meant. Well, how on earth could they answer my compelling question if they had no idea what it meant?
Yeah.
And so now, really focusing, like sometimes I think we go, I don't have time for that. I've got to get into this. I've got to get into that. And then when I get to the summative, I go, well, you know what? I didn't make time for that. And now these students have no idea how to answer the compelling question because they don't truly know what it means. So there's no way.
Yeah, I think, just to comment on a few things there, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the worst possible time to roll out standards that are this sophisticated. I mean, it's been a train wreck. And I can say that personally of trying to navigate, 500 teachers in this. It's been very difficult. The points that you're making, though, they give hope, right? Is these small incremental changes that you begin to make. The best time to have done these would have been maybe without COVID in July of 2019. The next best time is tomorrow, right? And so that's sort of what helps keep me understanding the idea that, okay, I can deconstruct this part of the standard. I can use this type of assessment. I can start to move towards this type of task. But one of the things that becomes a major barrier to that, and I want to go back to this prompt. Every bit of the information that students are going to need is given to them. And it's taken me such a long time to convince teachers to let go, as you said, Angie, this idea that I've got to cover all these things. What good is knowing all the information in the world if you can't write a single sentence that expresses it? If you can't write and use evidence to back it, and if you can't have reasoning that connects it? I'm not interested in all the knowledge. I don't need that kind of student. I've got a machine that does that. What I don't have is a living, breathing human being who is trying to figure out something and have that click go off in their head, and not just have it go off in their head, but to let it shine, right, in the work that they produce. And that becomes one of the major elements, right? And so that's been, obviously I'm leaning as heavy as I can on the inquiry aspects of things, right, into even assessing the writing piece of this, into the literacies of it. It's not because I don't value information. I'm just letting you know that information sitting by itself doesn't mean anything. It's worthless.
Right. And
Can I-
sorry, go ahead. Kay.
Well, I
Yeah.
was just gonna say, this is something that I was talking with Lauren Galicchio who's at KDE over social studies yesterday about. I think it's important to, as a social studies teacher, you know that you're not alone in this, because this is what your language arts teachers are doing too. And I think one of the important things that has to happen is to open up that door and have a conversation with them about what is it that those kids know about writing and critical thinking and supporting with evidence from your class, and holding those kids accountable to that knowledge in your class as well. So I know this is new and it's a part of inquiry, but you're not alone. You've got someone else in your building that's helping you. And if you can really get to know those people and have those conversations, then if you know that they know how to write and support with evidence in that classroom, hold them accountable to the same thing in your classroom and don't reteach it. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, and actually, just to add on to that, one of the things that is so important about this process, especially writing process, is that my students were terrified of writing in my class. Not because I gave bad grades, like 90% of my kids had A's, right? Because I'm going to try to scaffold those kids for everybody to find success throughout the year. It doesn't do me any good as a human being to know that I've failed X number of kids. It actually reveals that I've been a bad teacher, right? It's the same way, like, yeah, I could be a coach and write such a masterful workout that it literally kills my athletes, but then I've killed my athletes. What's the point? But I read every single thing that those kids wrote, and I gave feedback on every single thing that those kids wrote. Now, I'm not having them write every day, right? But when I strategically go to have them write, those kids know that I've read everything. Right. And not only that, but I would keep logs of the major things that each kid was doing. Right. And what was going on. So I could remember those conversations. Right. I did that through this process. This was my log. Right. These single point rubrics allowed me then to see with a certain kid to say, OK, all right, I've noticed that you continue to do this with evidence. Let's now work on this together, this specific thing. Right. And I can individualize that maybe with Kay, where with Jill, I'm looking at clarity of language, right? Because there's a lot of kids, and I'll be honest with you, this is typically what we see. To a T, your quote unquote good kids, who are the quote unquote good writers, will have the evidence there, right? We'll have the clarity there, and we'll have the accuracy there. But guess what? Their claims oftentimes don't say anything. There's no reasoning to it. There's no point to it, right? But they know how to put it all together. And your quote unquote, poor performers oftentimes have a point. They know exactly this is wrong or this is right, or I agree with this, I don't agree with that. They just don't have the structure. They don't know how to pull evidence in to help prove that which they're seeing, right? Which is why oftentimes when I work with teachers one-on-one, I ask them to pull what they consider to be the best students writing and the worst students writing in their class. And then we look at the criteria and say, is that an accurate statement that this is the best and this is the worst? And we look at this criteria. Right. Right. And then it just becomes the degree to which these things become something, right? How accurate do you want those sixth graders to be to an earlier point at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year, right? How clear do you want them to be at the beginning of the year? You don't know that yet. And that's okay. That's part of the process of developing this over time with your students and also with your peers, right?
And I think another piece of that too, Ryan, is I don't think our students realize that what they learn in one class might be applicable in another class. And you almost have to tell them and give them permission that to be able to take something, like, for example, when I taught 7th grade, I gave them a graphic organizer, and then we were talking at lunch, and the science teacher was like, oh, I could really use that in my class today. But they don't transfer it from class to class because they don't think they should. So we have to give them permission to do that, because we are working together, and they should be things that they're learning in other classes should be overlapping, especially in terms of this rubric.
Yeah, in fact, actually, there's been when we've presented this rubric at the CATE conference, the Kentucky Administrators Association, a lot of them immediately said, can we use this in other content areas? There's nothing, all that would need to change is, what do you mean by evidence? So evidence, like for example, in science, you don't source scientific articles, right? My wife has a master's in chemistry. Her research is on that. If you guys have ever seen the back of credit cards, it has that little glue, right? You know what I'm talking about? She would actually, part of her research was at UK was figuring out what is the right composite of that type of, they're called polymetric plasticizers is what they're technically called. But what's the thickness of that so that it can be used as an adhesive to deliver drugs through a patch versus a needle, right? So that was like her early stuff, right? She's citing evidence in there, but she's not sourcing it because that's not how science works, right? If it goes through a peer-reviewed process, then science has already determined that this is a more accurate understanding. We have to, in the social studies, source something, right? It matters if information about Russia is coming from Vladimir Putin or from Joe Biden or from the Ukraine or from South Africa or from Ryan New, right? Or from one of your students. Whoever's giving that information, it matters who's saying it because it affects the credibility possibly of what's happening, right? So this is going to start to work in different fields or different disciplines in different ways. All right, last thoughts about some of this, because we're actually going to apply this, right? I'm not just going to be here to tell you these things. We're going to actually apply this to claims, but we're going to take a quick break, if that's okay with everyone.
Ryan, one of the things in the chat is that a lot of their kids don't know how to critically think. So may want to just briefly give some suggestions on how to do that.
Yeah, it's a literally just the other day I was talking with a teacher who said, my kids have evidence, they just can't do reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of it comes down to the teacher wasn't actually teaching any skills and where they would actually have to think critically. One of the things that we've leaned into in one of the sessions that we're happy to talk about, Kay, is about inferencing. How do you infer from a source? Too often how social studies has been, and even the way that, if you guys all remember this, right? Or at least I'm dating myself, I'm going to be 40 this year. We were supposed to be the champions of the 2000, right? The special ones. I graduated in 2000. Sorry to my 1999 and 2001 friends here. But back whenever I was in school, you would have these questions at the end of the chapter. You would be assigned these on the board, right? And you go and you find where the information is and you copy down the information. That's not what this is. Inferencing is incredibly difficult to figure out how to do of what we might infer from a thing, which is different than what an interpretation is, right? And so some of that thinking is why we leaned into the disciplines of looking at like cause and effect. Like that's something that that's a reasoning thing to say, this caused this, and then be able to use evidence to show how one thing here caused another thing. That's reasoning, right? The reasoning to me is, how do you fill the gaps created by your claim and your evidence, right? So the claim, you're inferring is just not a really good inference, right? And so, for example, we've got, we're developing some stuff about one of the things I began with inferencing, not to give it away to you guys, but is I found a picture of a living room and there is a turned over table and there's pieces everywhere and there's a Monopoly board on the ground. What can we infer about this image, right? Now, an inference is the amount of background knowledge or what you observe using disciplines like sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading, and the background knowledge that you come with. So if you never played Monopoly, right, with a family, then you would never understand why Monopoly is the funny part of this, right? Like everybody who's ever been there knows that, right? But I'm also contextualizing. I'm doing a close read about there's a table flipped over. There's this that's happened, right? This is the specific game, right? But then also my background knowledge helps me do that. That's just the beginning point of a larger PD that we do with our teachers, right? To sort of talk about specifically inferencing, which is easy to do with Monopoly game, but not as easy to do when you're talking about a map, right? Or about data, right? So for example, the other day I was working with a middle school to do a taking informed action when it came to doing a survey. And so we put together a survey, which was a dumb survey, right? But it was just a survey to sort of show the different ways in which you can ask questions to introduce those. But then also I was trying to figure out right? How well could they reason from the data they might collect? One of the questions we ask is, when did students go to bed? And we gave these ranges, right? Well, if, like, I think it was like 30% of kids had gone to bed after 11 o'clock, right? And I said, so what can we infer from this data, right? And the answer is, some people in here are probably tired and sleepy, right? So just being able to have kids understand that piece, that was like an enormous leap for most of that class. And they're like, when I said, what can we infer about this? The students there just went to the description. They just said, well, we can infer that people went to bed late. No. That's what the data tells us. That's what our observation tells us, right? We can describe that. We can see that, but that doesn't mean that we're inferring from it, right? It could mean that, if half the class was that way, and I also knew that the Super Bowl was the night before, then I can infer that maybe people, right, stayed up later to watch the Super Bowl, right? Something like that. So if that makes sense, right? So that's just an example of us looking at some of that inference. Well, and that, what Angie was talking about earlier is that metacognitive piece to this. I highly encourage everyone here to just, like, we were doing to speak in a metacognitive way, to get the kids to understand what you want them to do and how to think about it. Like, guys, this is an inference, right? This is what we mean to infer. Here's an example of it. Kay just gave a great example of how to explain inference. How can we then apply that to this other thing? And then you do that 1,000 times and you get better at it, right? It's the same thing of, here's a ball, here's a basket, try to throw the ball in the basket. And the more you do it with good coaching, guess what? The more accuracy you gain, right? That's how we grow and learn and all this other jazz, right? All right, so I put into the chat, if you don't mind to open it, it's gonna make a copy of this presentation, right? And I wanted you guys to have your own workspace. So I'm gonna put that into the chat again. Right, so if everybody will go ahead and make a copy of the presentation, and then go down to slide 14, right? Slide 14. What we're going to do with the rest of the time remaining here is that we're going to test this. We're going to sort of calibrate as much as we can, but we're going to do it in a scaffolded way. I'm also going to introduce you to a writing piece here that I love to do when using this rubric, called an SFI association. What an SFI association is that you give 3 terms in which you want students to associate. What is the relationship between these 3 terms, okay? And what I'd like you to do, and you guys should all have access to your own, and if you don't, then I've really messed up, and I think I probably have. But hopefully you can, on your own, can anybody tell me if they can write on theirs? Because I just realized that might not be right.
Yes, I can write on my copy that I made.
Yes, I can too.
Excellent. Thank you guys very much. So what I'd like you guys to do, right over here is where you can write this. And the reason I'm going to have you write it here is so that you can copy and paste it and put it into the chat. Now, this is the only part here where I'm going to actually have you guys write a sentence and we're going to judge that sentence. Okay. And we're going to judge. Yeah, go ahead.
What does the SFI mean again?
Yes. So SFI means specific factual information.
Okay.
Right. So we all know that a PLC is a thing, right? Assessment's a thing, instruction's a thing, the Cold War, railroads, it's just something specific and factual, things that nobody would be like, my God, what are you talking about, right? It's different than vocabulary. Vocabulary can include things like conjunctions, right? And transition words and that kind of stuff. This is like factually, a thing, right? And so I've given you guys 3 terms, right? Or 3 SFI, however you want to talk about them, in which you're going to make an association. I've given you guys here so don't start yet. I've given you guys here the assignment here, write 1 clear, concise sentence that shows the association between the SFI. Your SFI is PLC, assessment, and instruction. I'm going to give you guys exactly 2 minutes. That's right, only 2 minutes, just like I would do with my students, although I actually gave them typically 60 seconds, but I scaffold them up to that 60 seconds. 2 minutes here to think about the association of these 3 terms. You must use all 3 terms And you can use any variants. You can use them twice, whatever you want to do, right? Right. So you can say assessments, for example, right? Or instructional materials or something like that, right? Just as long as the term is there. And then we're going to have a few of you guys volunteer your sentences, and we're going to figure out if they are accurate or clear based on these types of criteria, right? Then what we're going to do is move on to a completely different thing, right? That you guys are probably already looking at. But right now, this is where like we're going to put our money where our mouth is, experts on this. Let's get into the kids' heads a bit about how hard it is to write, and especially how hard it is to write when you're about to share this and be judged on it. And everyone who's about to share out, even though I'm saying this, is still going to do it, which is you're going to say, well, you know, I'm not always the best writer, and you're going to start to qualify your writing, okay? And that's going to tell us how much that we as a society have created fear out of expression. And that's something that we're going to have to work on in the class, right? Okay, so 2 minutes here, 2 minutes in your own box. You're going to write a clear, concise sentence that shows the association between the SF5. Any questions before we get going? Okay, time. All right, so the anonymous pumpkin, who's on my screen right now, you are on my piece, but that's okay because we're going to use your sentence. So please don't erase it. And we'll never know who you are, so you don't have to say anything, right? But what I'd like you to do, right, is to copy and paste your sentence into the chat, right? So go ahead and copy and paste your sentence into the chat. And then what we're going to do is we're going to see how, you know, we're going to put this criteria to it, right? Not to all of them, but I want you guys to see in the chat all the different variations in which that students can actually do these things. So go ahead and blow the chat up here, right? Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to pull out a couple here, right? I'm going to put them on my screen, whoops, along with the anonymous pumpkin. And I'm just choosing these at random. There's no real value attached to these other than I chose them at random. And you can look at your own. Okay, so let's say we've got, if you don't mind to look back at my screen, we've got example 1, just so we can know which ones we're talking about. EG1. We have EG2. EG3. Okay, so let's take a look at the first one. What would we write, right? And I want you guys to do this on your own, like on your actual own, your own copy here, where it says detractors and enhancers, things like that. I want you guys to take a look at the one I'm highlighting here, right? A PLC should be used to evaluate our instruction through looking at assessment data. What would you say to this person, to this anonymous pumpkin, right? Did they hit the assessment criteria as far as accuracy and clarity? Is there something that detracts in this one sentence that you think should be noted? Or what are some things here that you should put for the enhancers? I'll give you guys here about 90 seconds. Again, what you're doing in this 90 seconds is just on your own, without calibration, without anything else, put into either detractors or enhancers. And either of those boxes could be empty, by the way, right? You can leave all 4 of them empty if you think they're right on, that's fine. But we're looking at this sentence here that I have highlighted. A PLC should be used to evaluate our instruction through looking at assessment data. I'll give you guys here 90 seconds to record through detractors, enhancers are right on with on your slide. And time. Okay, so what would we say here? Anybody have any detractors when it comes to accuracy or clarity? Or does anybody have any enhancers when it comes to accuracy or clarity? And this is the part where there's got to be a lot of discussion. Otherwise, it's going to be really tough, right? So please unmute. And we need to really talk through this because this is where the rubber meets the road.
So Ryan, this is Christine Meisberger. I wrote down a detractor could be that the PLC has a definitive purpose, like why it should be used, because not all PLCs, I don't know. Anyway, that's what I wrote down.
No, Christine, good to see you today. Let's talk this through. You said not all PLCs, right?
Yeah.
Do this, right? Or
Yeah.
have one purpose.
Right. Correct. Yeah.
Okay, now Christine, this is the part. Thank you for being the brave soul who went first. Because what we're going to now do is, do other people agree or disagree with Christine on this one point?
Let me jump in. This is Kayla Dameron, and I'm defending my content partner because she and I, the reason why we work so well together is because I literally said the exact same thing, Chris, that not every PLCs aren't, we PLC for many different reasons. So this is just showing one aspect of why we PLC.
Okay, so let's then think about what we would say back to Anonymous Pumpkin to improve this, right? So you could put, can you reword PLCs to show what?
Can you reword PLCs to show intention or yeah.
Maybe we could say this specific PLC meeting should be focused on.
So that is not an accuracy issue. That's a clarity issue, right? So they could make this more clear, right? It could still be accurate, right? But what, and I forgot who was speaking there, and I cut you off before I could see your name. But what you're saying is that, we could put, one example of PLCs or something like that, right? So that you're changing to make the language more clear of one instance in which you might use them versus a more blanketed statement, which is less accurate, that they have multiple, that they only have a single purpose. Right?
Yes.
You see how this works?
Yes.
So it really depends on what that student is, or what Anonymous Pumpkin is really trying to say here, right? So, okay, I just want to let you guys know here that both of these are accurate ways of going about this process, right? Because we don't know based on this one sentence, right? Objectively trying to figure out, because you guys all said earlier, right? Remember, we're trying to figure out how well we taught this lesson and how well kids can understand these things, right? So we can only go now objectively. And by the way, now exit slips and formative performance tasks mean 10,000 times more what they have ever meant before, right? Do we objectively have a clue that this one person knows what's going on? Because Christine and Kayla could be like, man, I don't think they're very accurate here, when it actually could be a clarity issue, right? So if the Anonymous Pumpkin were to rewrite this as, one example of a PLC, right, is that PLC should, be used to do this thing. Now the accuracy is taken care of because of the clarity of the language.
And that's kind of how I took it whenever you gave us the SFI set of PLC assessment and instruction. My mind directly went to kind of like, I'm receiving an email from my administrator that says, today in our PLC, when you come, bring with you anything that is going to help us discuss assessment and instruction. Mm-hmm. So instead of PLC in general, the way that they took it, I took it as this one specific PLC was going to focus on assessment and how we are to use that to drive our instruction. So that goes back to all of our students, how we talked earlier, they all bring different things to the table. Right. And how it has to be extremely clear, or we're going to get a variety of answers, and that's going to point out to us maybe we didn't focus enough or give them enough background to know what we were wanting from them.
Or that they weren't able to pull from certain sources, right? Or whatever the case might be, right? So, because it could be that, that there could be multiple answers. That's okay, right? We're seeing, just on the screen here, there's multiple interpretations of this, right? But what's interesting is that I'm even thinking about a PLC, right? A means what? Any,
yeah.
Right? Versus the PLC, right? Or, I mean, you can even be as specific as the next PLC, or, you know, the PLC on Friday did this thing, right? All those provide greater accuracy and clarity simultaneously, right? And our question that we've been sort of wrestling with it's David, right?
Yes.
That David is bringing up is like, we've got to be sort of on the page here with understanding, one, the variety of responses we can get, and two, how those kids arrived at the variety of those responses, right? We got to do a lot of thinking. Yeah.
Especially coming from from my perspective of a special education teacher, those kiddos, to get what I need from them, I almost have to give them a checklist.
Okay.
Here's what the question is. After you have finished answering the question, can you go back and check off, I did restate, check. I did answer the question, check. I did put I did cite, and then I did find the evidence. I did explain. So yeah, the more clear we can be, then it helps everyone, but especially my kiddos.
Well, and David, you raised a really good point of why a checklist is a fantastic, in my opinion, of a scaffold put in to help kids reach a certain conclusion, where this is an assessment criteria to assess what those conclusions they reached, right? So sometimes, checklist, again, can be good, in my mind at least, as a scaffold, but if they become the assessment of what you're doing, then it becomes a checklist for those kids. And I was like, well, they did it all, even though it could all be gobbledygook, right? Still, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so so you guys can sort of see where I'm going with this, right? Let's take a look at the second one, right? During our PLC time, we analyze student data and model ways to better assess them. So I'm going to do the exact same thing as before. You guys can just erase the detractors and enhancers you had before, right? And let's look at just this one here, right? So I'll give you guys another 90 seconds. Okay, and time. So again, I don't know whose this one was. I just, again, chose at random. Please don't take any of this personal, right? We're just throwing our sentence up here, right? But if you're feeling like that student would totally feel in the class, I was like, oh my God, of all the ones he had to choose, it was mine. I will go ahead and apologize for you in advance, right? So what would you guys say here? As far as detractors, but we went with detractors last time. Let's see if there's any enhancers in the audience here, because I will say we have a tendency when looking at writing to be incredibly negative, right? And I encourage you to be thinking about not just the detractors, right, but the enhancers. The enhancers help us leverage kids to get better. Detractors means that our work is cut out for us and we need to move the needle faster, right? So remember that this reveals quite a bit about what you bring to the table, your bias, your understanding, your experience, your expertise, right, to the table as much as the enhancers do. So we always have to be careful, right, of not just, like, oh yeah, I could pick this one apart pretty quick, or, oh yeah, because remember, this sentence is only 2 minutes good. That's what you need to remember. It's a 2-minute good sentence. That's it. Okay, what would you guys have to say here?
Well, I would say just assuming like this is about the PLC that this teacher meets in, this would be accurate about what the purpose of the PLCs that they regularly meet with are, and then it's very clear what they're doing, what the goal that they have for their PLC is.
Okay, so we've got one that says goal is clear and accurate. And again, this may not be an enhancer, right? I will tell you this. Early on in the years, I used the enhancer box way more, right? For obvious reasons. As the year goes on, then those kids really have to like live in those spaces. But I'm just trying to honor the best things that I can see early on so that kid doesn't feel like they're a terrible writer, right? What else? And this could be enhancers or detractors. I just want to make sure we got one enhancer here.
I mentioned oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just mentioned something about, and I don't know if this would necessarily apply, but being specific in your language.
Okay.
So like identifying who we, our, and them, like who that's referencing. You know, I have students that write claims that start out with he. Who is he?
That's one, Leah, that I saw right on this one as well, right? I don't know who those folks are, right? During our PLC time, you know, do we even need our there, right? Just during PLC time, right? Or do we need some kind of qualifier during some of our PLC time, which could mean over the year or even on an individual day, right? Or individual meeting. We analyze, what if we were to replace we with, you know, like for example, we were to put during PLC time, 6th grade teachers in social studies analyzed, right, student data. That would then tell me exactly the department, the exact grade of what's happening there, right? Other thoughts on this?
Yeah, or even just taking, you know, yourself out of it and just saying, you know, during PLC time, student data is analyzed.
Okay. Well, in that case, actually, I'm gonna nitpick that one. Is that okay, Leah?
Yes,
is
sir.
Say, yeah, is analyzed. We're not saying who the ones who are doing all the analysis, right? Which means then that we can't hold those folks accountable. So to me, it would become, you know, teachers analyze, right? That way we keep it in the active voice. I know this is being super picky, right? As an element of it, but just to sort of bring that other thought to bear, right?
And Ryan, there's a note in the chat. It says it is clear that they analyze data, but the detractor is it doesn't clarify what data are we looking at?
Yeah, is that could be an accuracy issue, or that could be, you know, what do you mean by student data, right? But at the same time, right, I could easily put it, or let me put this over here. What type, right? Especially, this is where it comes in to where, especially if we were just looking at sources, right? Like if we just read a source talking about student writing, then a more accurate phrase would be we analyze student writing, not necessarily student data, right? Or if it's looking at student, like if I were to be like, oh, well, multiple choice, you know, free response, or sorry, multiple choice, extended response, then they might put during PLC times, we analyze multiple types of student data, right? Because that at least allows them to the next sentence be able to clarify what multiple types might mean. But I could also see, right, hey, you know what, student data, perfect, right? We can see that in the very first sentence, that's already a kind of a quote unquote improvement upon the data that is being mentioned here, right? We just have data is being analyzed, but we don't know what type of data. Is it student data? Is it K-Prep data? Now a Kentucky Summative Assessment data, right? You guys can sort of see where, and again, I'm not trying to spin you guys off into it. My God, there's a never ending region of thought that can go into this. I'm just letting you guys know that everything that we identify on something, we're trying to assess how well does a kid know something by the words in which they say. That's what it means to communicate conclusions, right? If we see error, we have to be able to point out specifically that error, to be able to categorize that error, and then be able to help them with that error, giving them an alternative of how we want them to go about writing. Feedback on writing is a painstaking process because it doesn't just allow us to say, you got a 3 today. Because as a kid, whenever I was in a classroom, I would go up and be like, what does a 3 mean? Right? That was me as a student, right? What does a 3 mean? Oh, well, it means this. Well, then why didn't you say that? How am I going to improve from 3? How can I get a 4? If the answer is, well, you just need to do better, right? Then it's like, okay, well, then why are you here? Yeah, okay, I know I need to do better here, but what can I specifically do to do better? And if you can't answer that, then you can't assess that kid on that understanding.
If we are just giving kids the number 3 or 4 without giving them the rubric where we circled what they did, the good and what we thought were the strengths and weaknesses, then we're, in my personal opinion, we're not doing it, doing them any service. They need it. So if you're giving them a 3 or a 4, then they definitely need to have the rubric in their hand so they can answer that question themselves.
And to be able to understand it, but they still may not know like the skills or knowledge needed to be able to move forward, right? So that becomes one of the major issues. Let's take a look then at a second one. So this is, I want you to go down to slide 16. And I'm gonna shuffle some stuff up for us real quick, okay? Now you've got 3 new terms. You don't get to Google these terms. You got 2 minutes, write one clear, concise sentence that associates these 3 terms: scratch, toe board, shot. You may begin. And yes, I'm doing this to you intentionally.
I just cannot wait to hear these.
Yep. Okay, time. You guys can start to put yours into the chat here. And as people are starting to put theirs in the chat, please take a look at what other people have said. This is a good example, by the way, of what our students sometimes feel, right? Whenever they don't know the vocabulary that we're using, and then they're trying to reassemble them in a way, although I didn't use any of this vocabulary, right? All right, so I just sort of chose at random these 3. Okay, not exactly at random. This one was intentional. Okay, so in doing this, right, this is one, again, part of this is, and we've skipped over a few here. You guys can easily take these back if you found this valuable and do this with your PLC. So you've got a few there to look at. But this one here, we've got this completely other thing here, right? So just to give it away here, right? This one here is the most accurate, right? Because the second one here didn't use all 3 of the terms, right? That was part of this, although they're closer to it than the first one, right? Now there's a few that are way off base. I didn't pull those in, right? I don't want to embarrass anybody on any way, stretch your imaginations on some of this. But this is a track thing, right? This is a shot put. There's a toe board. If you go past the toe board or you touch the toe board, whenever you throw your shot, you scratch, and your throw doesn't count. They don't measure it. They might measure it if they're really kind to you, but it doesn't count as a measurement, which is why then we can just sort of look at this, right? So I'm going to now model my understanding of this as a teacher. See if you guys, since we didn't get a chance to really look at the accuracy or clarity of this, let's take a look at the first one here. All right, so I'm just going to model this. So when the shot hit the toe board, okay, if the shot is hitting the toe board, right, that means that that student took the shot put and just slammed it straight into the ground, right? Not only would it be a scratch, but there would be some serious injury that would occur, possibly, or damage to the thing. That student would probably be disqualified and talked to by their coach, right? So, but they were trying to associate, right, in this, that the shot hit the toe board. So in my mind, I'm trying to figure out, okay, their language is clear here. It's just not very accurate. They're showing one thing to another thing, right? There's nothing wrong with the clarity of this. It's just not accurate, right? There's no such thing as points in track and field. When it comes to this, it would be measurement. When it comes to that, but they are also correct, by the way, right? They are accurate that if a shot put does hit the scratch board, right, it is a scratch, right? If you do take the shot put and throw it straight down into the toe board, that's a scratch. So that's accurate, but everything else is sort of out there, right? But I could still see that in this one, you know what? I understand in a clear way what you're saying. It's just not accurate. If we look at the last one, if an athlete walks over the front of the toe board while throwing a shot, right? That is, it is considered a scratch for that throw. So this is really interesting. That throw is like tying it to that, the language there, that throw implies the one in which the student walks over the toe board. But what I would still say is that while this is accurate, it could be more accurate because walks over the front of the toe board could mean a couple things in track and field. Walks over the toe board if the student made an error because their momentum was carrying them, we wouldn't necessarily call that walks over. But there could be a situation where an athlete who had a bad throw does not want that throw to be counted, and then to show their frustration, steps on the toe board. That way it doesn't have to be measured because they're angry, they know it's short, they know it's not great, doesn't matter, and that could still be accurate, right? Make sense? The middle one, the athlete scratched after stepping over the toe board, that is clear, but I don't know where the shot put fits in, so therefore I can't count this as fully accurate because I don't know if it's during the throw, after the throw, while throwing. I don't know if they understand where the shot's happening during that time, right? And then just for just for this one, right? Yeah, Caitlin, you can always tell folks who have been in track before within this. One scratch, this is interesting. One scratch was declared as a penalty for an athlete. So penalty would be, right, they're clearly, this student is clearly getting to this point, right? Sorry if I'm projecting who this is, but one scratch was declared a penalty. We wouldn't call that a penalty in track and field, right? We would call that just a scratch, right? That it just means it doesn't count, right? So this would be one where like a penalty, like in the sense that you might have a penalty in football, that might be where some of this comes from. That might be an issue here. Let me see if I can find one more that's just way off. Okay, this is perfect. This is perfect. I love this one very much. Okay. For this student, a roofer's toe board is for balance when needing to scratch or taking a shot from a bird. Okay, so this is fantastic. So this is in a situation where I guess a bird is either pecking at their eyeballs or scratching their face. By George, that roofer has had a bad day. But this is one where, again, it's super clear but not accurate, right? So I wanted to give an example where you're working on two things simultaneously, and this person's response here allows us to see an episode when a person could be very clear with their language but not accurate, right? Thoughts or just reactions to this exercise and trying to see what we might mean. One, from just being able to sort of see the difficulty of trying to give feedback to each of these individuals based on how you guys might measure them as a detractor enhancer from that criteria. Thoughts on this?
This is not exactly what you asked, but it's just something that I'm kind of seeing here. So we should be teaching our students to identify the important vocabulary words in the question and use those words in their answer.
Yep. And to be able to bring in any other associated terms. That's right. Yep, 100%. Yep. And we actually saw that in the exemplar that the state gave about the reciprocal relationship, right? They're actually proving that reciprocal relationship, but they're using that terminology in it. Yep, 100%. What else? Other reactions? Let me ask you this. Did you find it easy or difficult to do detractors and enhancers? With just, by the way, the two, the ones I would consider the easier of the four, right? Just determining if something is clear and accurate.
I thought it was really.
Go ahead.
I love this, and I thought it was really easy to use, and I can see how you could give this to a student and get them talking about detractors and enhancers and picking it out and using that as a way for them to like peer coach one another. And it just really highlighted background knowledge, especially when you talk about the track one, that I thought was really neat.
Yeah, and this is oftentimes what we start to see as teachers, right? And so, but Kimberly, you're adding that other nuance to this, which is a lot of our kids to be able to go, which is how can I help with my classmate, right? If we go back and look at this, imagine using this exact same thing with what we just did. This is my problem with some of this, to be honest with you, right? It's not. Doesn't help the student. I don't see any situation where a student then suddenly says, well, you completed all the components for the item, right? Or, well, that was a more efficient process that you utilized there, right? Versus what we were doing on that first example, right? And even this one that I tried to model, the second one, what would I give to make something more accurate? So I could then immediately say penalty, not part of that. But that allows me then to clarify with that student immediately, right? That feedback of what's going on. Oh, instead of penalty, maybe you should use this, right? As an example, or the one that we used earlier, right? About, oh, well, we actually, like this one here, instead of using our, we, and them, can we be more specific with who you're talking about? Because it doesn't make it very clear. Whoever said earlier, I've got students who begin with he, right? The same thing happens with this and these and those. What are you talking about, right? Those only operate whenever they've been established, like I just did in that sentence, right?
Is there any specific reason that these are called enhancers and detractors? I mean, would
Yes.
there be anything wrong with calling it positives and negatives or pluses and minuses if we wanted to give this to a student?
I'm so glad, Jessica, that you asked that. I forgot to explain where these came from. I developed these specific language detractors enhancers with Jerry Swan, who works at UK, right, and does a lot of assessment stuff, works with Tom Guskey in assessment. He suggested whenever I was doing the single point rubric and trying to come up with, I didn't come up with it obviously using a single point rubric, but we were testing it out to see what needed to be there. This was, I don't know, 7 years ago or something, 8 years ago. And he suggested that we use detractors and enhancers. And I said, why? And he said, because that's how music does it. And I thought it was a beautiful understanding. If I were to be learning to play guitar and I'm trying to get better, and my guitar teacher said, a positive you did was this, a negative you did was this, then I'm gonna feel that negative. The negative language matters a lot to a beginner who's learning something, right? Imagine if I said to you guys when you came out, well, man, these are a bunch of negative sentences, right? Then you guys are gonna hate me instantly as a person. But what he was meaning, because it's good with music, is that I'm learning to play guitar. And if I were to come up here and play guitar for you guys, right, which I'm not going to do, no matter how much you guys ask me to do, I'm not going to play guitar. But if I were to, there's times where I could detract from my performance, right? So if I'm playing a song and I have a hard time playing B minor, I really do. I don't know what it is, but I have a hard time playing B minor. Anytime I play B minor in a song, it could actually detract from the performance, but you wouldn't say that I can't play guitar. It's just that whenever I play specifically B minor, that it detracts from what I'm trying to do, right? So whenever the person earlier used our, we, and them, they were still clear with their language. It's just that these specific words were detracting from understanding what they were trying to say. However, if I were playing guitar and I was able to use, there's a few songs that I play, like Love is Blindness, for example, not the crappy U2 version, even though it's the original, it's the Jack White version, right? Because it's got this passion and emotion in it, right? When I'm playing that song, especially on acoustic, I have to be very soft and loud at certain times, right? That could actually enhance the performance. It's nothing that's guaranteed. I don't have to do it. God knows U2 didn't do it, but Jack White did it. And I felt like it enhanced that understanding. So you could then be putting, Ryan, when you're playing guitar, it enhanced based upon the tonal use that you used by employing the pick during these times in the song, right? If that makes sense. So enhancers and detractors were a way of sidestepping the more negative language that oftentimes gets associated with doing something wrong, negative, a con, or whatever else might be associated in those ways. So this was a very intentional element to say, just like an actor who is hiccuping on stage while doing Hamlet, that's detracting from the performance, but nobody would question that they're not watching an actor on stage, that the lines weren't accurate of what they were saying. It's just get the guy a glass of water, right? He's detracting from our performance. Does that make sense? So that's the reason why I use detractors and enhancers, and I never had an issue with it. In fact, even having my kids use that language helps soften the way in which students talked about writing, which again, those who we were looking at improving, quote unquote, improving your sentences, you guys were feeling that already, right? You guys were feeling like, man, oh man, and it's easy just to crush somebody, right? I could just be like, poor person who did this last one down here. This person doesn't have a clue about track and field, right? And just me even saying that, even though it's very clear, even though this is like the greatest sentence in the entire world, it's made my morning. I love it so much. This is something that like we can all sort of like joke about it, but it probably still sings that I'm still joking about this, right? A little bit, right? Because if that person were to unmute and say, I just didn't know, I went with something. Well, by George, that's the most human thing possible. And that's exactly what our students do. And so if they're in the moment of being vulnerable and human, then we have to figure out what can enhance that and what can detract from it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, glows and grows was put in there. I think that's also fine. Again, it doesn't matter to me. The question is just, what do you call these columns in which you're giving feedback on, right? I think that's personally fine too. We talked about it. I just fell in love with this idea of the music side of things because it's more romantic to me. Because there is a skill. There's a skill when it comes to writing, no doubt about it, right? But there's a reason why we read certain authors, right? Because they have a style. And to me, this brings a style to the rubric as a personal thing. Okay, what we're gonna do next, right? We're almost out of time here. What we're gonna do next is that if you'll notice on the next ones, and I'm gonna allow you guys to do any one that you want. Doesn't matter, okay? We're not gonna go into breakout rooms. But I want you to look at any of the following claims. So I'm gonna show them to you, right? I want you to look at and give feedback in a full account, right? This is accurate, clear evidence and reason, right? So again, I was trying to scaffold for you guys here. Your all's questions have driven our time up a bit, which is fantastic. But I've given 4 options. 2 of them, right? So there's 2 sets here. There's option A and B for each question. So on slide 17, what were the positive aspects of the Industrial Revolution in the Gilded Age? There's your question. Here's a formative performance task. Create a claim backed with evidence that answers the supporting question. Here's student A. Here's where I'd like you to put your detractors and enhancers. Here's student B, if you'd rather do, so you're going to do either A or B, right? Not both, right? For that one question. Here is a separate question, right? If you don't like that question at all, here's a separate question. It's a compelling question, right? So this is actually a claim that was part of a larger thing at the end of a unit, right? What divides a nation, right? Although I've still got a claim here. That's fine. It just to make it work in this situation. Just think of a question and claim. It doesn't matter. Here is a student C and student D. Both student C and D are answering the same question, and student A and B are answering the same question. Okay, does it make sense? Right? So student A and B are answering the exact same question. What were the positive aspects of the Industrial Revolution? C and D are answering the same question. What divides a nation? Looking at specifically enslavement. Right? What I'd like to do is I'd like to give you guys here right at 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, please read through one of those 4 students. Okay? Then after each of those students, I've just given you guys a box here, right? That has the exact same box, doesn't matter, right? That has detractors and enhancers. And what I'd like you to do is give feedback exactly as you would to this student, because these actually all are from what has survived my classroom. These are all real students, right? In which I gave feedback to them in a very similar way. Okay. So detractors, enhancers, accuracy, clarity, evidence, and reason. What would you say to this student? Mind you, A and B folks, this is about mid-year. C and D folks, this is first unit, if that matters to you. Okay. If that matters to you. All right. I'm going to set a timer here for 8 minutes. And I will let you guys know when halfway is done and then 2 minutes to go. Okay, so just again, choose one of the 4 students. Read it, assess it, detractors and or enhancers, right? And then we're going to talk about on the other side. 8 minutes, you may begin. Okay, final 30 seconds as you're wrapping up what you might say. Let me just say that the obvious thing here, and I think somebody's already put it in the chat, is that this is time consuming. It is, right? Anytime that any kind of growth that's going to happen is going to be, right? Teaching my son to read is going to be time consuming. Teaching athletes how to throw a shot is time consuming. Teaching people to write, which might be the most complicated academic endeavor that your kids are going to engage in, is going to take time. I typically gave this kind of level of feedback once a week. And in fact, even just sitting here doing this, I know I'm going to sound like a crazy person. This is the part of the job I actually miss the most, because it's where I saw everything come together, right? It allowed me to judge myself as a teacher, and I could see my students' knowledge grow. You're literally seeing my students figure things out, right? All the conversations we had, the sources we looked at, the conversations, their reasoning is brought to bear in what you guys are saying, right? To me, this is why we do what we do, is to find student learning in action, raised to the surface, not what we think happened, but what this is. And then we have to figure out, is this good enough? Can I sleep at night knowing that this is where my kids are and their understanding of the world? Okay, so who would like to share out? And if you don't mind, actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Kay, I don't know if everybody has a chance to share their screen, but I would love for someone to share their screen of what they put for their enhancers and detractors. Anyone willing to do so on a sunny Saturday?
I will. I don't think mine's the best. I don't think I did an awesome job, but I don't mind sharing.
It's okay, Jessica. We just learned about this like an hour ago, so we're all good. She's got good, excellent. Okay, so Jessica, please go first to the one which you looked at, so everybody can just take a quick overview of it.
Okay, I looked at student D.
Okay, so what divides a nation? Let's just give 30 quick seconds for folks to read through this claim, right? Just you don't have to evaluate it, but Jessica, if you can just hold on there on your screen for 30 seconds. Okay, so Jessica, walk us through what you think.
Okay, I felt like disciplinary information. They talked about slavery and that time period being the antebellum period, so that seemed accurate. I felt like they could be more clear. They were talking about how the society had lost its decency and faith in God and the fellow man, but I didn't feel like they clearly said how that divided the nation. So I thought they could be more clear there.
Do you mind to go back then to that, just so we can see this in action? So we see then this is in their, and this is sort of in their claim sentence, right?
Yes.
So there's a part of me that loves this idea, right? They lost its decency and faith in God and fellow man. And you think, man, this kid has just knocked it out of the park. Then they don't talk about this ever again.
Yeah. They didn't ever go back to the compelling question and talk about how these things divided the nation. I felt like their one piece of evidence they used was a good piece of evidence to show how people questioned the division. But I also felt like they needed more evidence than the one piece that they provided.
Perfect. Okay. Stop there for a second. Go back to the other one. So let's take a look at this. So remember, this is early on in the year, right? I only had them use one piece of evidence, but if you were to give them some advice here, go ahead and click on that one again. We see here that they talk about that George Washington owned slaves, right? So that would be an easy place for you to be able to give some suggestions to, right? Oh, well, you're quoting this other, like you've been influenced by this other source. Maybe you should bring in source C if this is source C, right? If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Okay.
And then their analysis, this one, to me, it seemed like they were trying to address the counterclaim, but they need to go ahead and explain why this is wrong.
Yeah. So do you mind to go back to the other one? Because I think this is like in their last, where is this?
Next to last sentence.
Yeah. So this is an attempt at a counterclaim. So what you've done really well here, Jessica, specifically in this one, I think the other ones are on the nose too. Specifically on this one, we have a scenario where, who's the some may, right? This is what you normally see. Critics are going to say that begins like every, 95% of counterclaims. Well, which critics? Who are these people? Do we trust them? Are these legitimate understandings? And they try to do it. But what you've done there is you've said, I've identified that this is your counterclaim. Is that accurate? And the kid says, yes. Now that you've established that, you can now talk to them about better counterclaims, right? If they say, oh, no, that was part of my reasoning. Okay, well then I'm missing. We're not on the same page with this. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jessica, for being the brave soul. Would somebody else like to be a brave soul? And by the way, one thing that we're not saying right now, right, is if you also had that same one, if you're in agreement with Jessica, right? That's where the calibration comes in, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not able to share my screen because my phone is on Zoom, but then my screen is on the computer monitor.
Okay.
But I did source C, or the student C there, with also what divides a nation. And I chose this because I am currently teaching 6th grade, and I see a lot of commonalities between student C and the students that I have in 6th grade. I felt like they knew facts about slavery, the slave revolts, They knew about the fugitive slave law. They had good vocabulary use. But they did the same thing that I see a lot of students in 6th grade doing, or my kids doing, is that instead of like abbreviating or paraphrasing the Fugitive Slave Act, they like tried to quote it all word for word.
What are you talking about? It only makes up half the entire claim.
Exactly. And then, so I just said, could there be an analysis of the Fugitive Slave Law Act and why was it important? And then I also asked about, could they have gone back to the claim at the end and shared their own analysis of it?
So you're saying that the detractor for you was in the evidence part about kind of the citing, right? That it's cited, but there's an issue with the citation. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
perfect. And that part of the clarity, right, could mean going back and making sure that that claim was a part of it, or maybe part of the accuracy, or maybe part of the reasoning. It depends, again, how you're seeing this. And just what we've seen from Jessica and Michelle sharing already is that we're seeing, or at least I'm seeing, that different teachers have different styles of what they expect out of students, right? And what that might mean, right? And the ramifications of that style conversation, right? Over, moving kids from, if Michelle goes to Jessica, like if Michelle's kids in 6th grade go to Jessica in 7th grade and then me in 8th grade, and we have different styles, that can really mess with a kid's development, right? Because now they feel like they're having to write to the teacher, and it's all like your all's college experiences all over again, versus actually writing to a criteria. Yeah, and Amy agrees with you, Michelle, about, they just dumped this whole thing. Now, I think this is like one of the very first claims they ever really wrote for me. I think this is like midway through the unit. So we'd already started to work on certain things here, but not where we needed to be.
Right. So in like my 6th grade, we did something very similar this week, and not all, but there was probably a solid percent, like quoted all of Buddha's Four Noble Truths. And it was like, no, this is not exactly what I want. So it's, I mean, we're saying the same thing, but I'm a very young grade level.
Yeah. And you can see like, here's some good reasoning, they're talking about, but they just don't back it up with evidence, right? Their evidence down below goes in a completely different direction. If you're talking about slave revolts and you think that this is going to put an even larger target, like on their back, like if I were talking to this kid, and I don't remember what I said to them, but like the Fugitive Slave Act is it a response to this understanding? Like I'm not sure the flow of thinking here, right? Where this is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, let alone the Fugitive Slave Act that was enacted in the Constitution. But like if you're talking about slave revolts, I mean, imagine if they were to list out some of these slave revolts, how much clearer it would be, right? Or if they're able to quote like, oh, well, here are some evidence from when all these different states started enacting, slave codes, right? Or something like that. That would be better evidence for that. But there's a disconnect between the evidence used. But this is also really good reasoning. So I don't want to just discount the reasoning. It's just they overshot the evidence here, right? And then they gave us, so point being, you gave me a bunch of good reasoning without any evidence and a bunch of evidence without any reasoning. That's an issue, right? But at least I've got through this criteria, and what Michelle was already doing is showing them exactly those issues, right? In very clear language that will be universally applied the rest of the year, possibly over a 6-8 period, right? But certainly for that one student, using the same kind of things that we're always hammering towards, right? Because this is so deceptively simple. And yet whenever you guys are looking at this, my guess, many of you guys are sitting here thinking, my God, this is going to take forever. My God, this is so complicated. What I'm saying is that, yeah, it's going to seem that way until you start to use it. And if it becomes the nature and focus of not only how you, but also your students talk about it, then what we're talking about is this becomes the vernacular of your class. And that assessment doesn't just become something you do at the end of the unit or maybe as a common formative assessment. It's something that you're talking about even with sources, right? So that when you're looking at when you're looking at the Fugitive Slave Act, you might be talking about, well, what evidence does it talk about? What's the reasoning it's being used here, right? Is it clear, right? Is it accurate to what was happening? And being able to even apply that same assessment rubric, right, to the actual analysis, right, of this a source is an appreciated element, I think, of a good rubric, so that kids can see it in practice of other people doing it, right? This is one that I know one of our teachers did. He was talking about how clear, accurate evidence and reason was the Declaration of Independence. Like, that's how he broke it down for his kids, right? As one of the early examples of using this rubric. It was a beautiful understanding. They literally had it all parsed out, right? Of what was clear, what wasn't clear, what was evidenced. They're looking at the grievances and tying those back to some of the acts that they'd studied previously. Beautiful work by Joel Dries. I'll give him a call out here from Cameron Middle School, right? So we're right at time, right? And I know that this actually might create more mud in which you to play in, right? Okay, yeah, and so this is more mud in which you to play in. That was part of the goal of today, right? Is to show you guys how you might approach it, how you might look at PLCs, giving you guys some things to look at there. I didn't get a lot of chance to talk about standards-based grading. Please reach out. That's free on the house. I'm happy to meet with you guys to talk about that, right? When it comes to it, of how we're envisioning standards-based grading because you'll notice on those rubrics that it says things like, and I know I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but early on that first rubric, let me go back to sharing the screen. Sorry, I apologize about this. I'm gonna go as quickly as I can. You'll note here that it says disciplinary standards, communicating conclusion standards, using evidence standards, and communicating conclusion standards. For us, those become buckets. There's no reason to parse out a lot of these things. It actually drives teachers insane. It's one of the reasons why a lot of teachers want to quit. Is if you're part of a PLC or an area that makes you parse out every single individual standard, I can show you a different way of how we're thinking about it, so that we only have 3 things that they're looking at when it comes to mastery. Are they accurate with their disciplinary standards? Which one? Doesn't matter. If you can use one accurately, you can probably use another one accurately. That's what we're moving towards, right? In a very big way. Do you need to break it down any further? Sure, that can come later on, but we don't need to parse out every single one of the 40 standards that each grade level has to teach in order to see mastery. Are they able to use disciplinary standards accurately? Perfect. Using evidence, doesn't matter which standard you're looking at. Are you using evidence accurately? Well, it depends on what you need for mastery. That grows necessarily, right? That's problematic. Are they moving towards that? Are they not moving towards that? That takes some time, right? And the same with communicating conclusions. That's a very quick brush version of this. I'm more than happy to meet, or even Kay, I can meet 30 minutes next time or whenever you guys are doing this. If you need me to fill in that spot, that's my fault for not getting to it today. And then the last thing I'll say here is just addressing the question that was there from Leah. I almost hate to ask this because I know this isn't the end goal. You're absolutely right, Leah. But you're also correct in how does this rubric translate to score in a grade book? I have been largely agnostic in our district about that because there's so many different things to consider when you're moving into that world. One thing that I would say is if you're moving into a 1, 2, 3, 4 world, what I encourage you to do, right, if that's a world for mastery or whatever the case was, be very careful with again, I'm happy to talk to anybody about this individually, right? Because I don't know what your school policies are, things like that. That's why we're largely agnostic about it. Because I'll say something and all of a sudden the district guy said the thing, or that one guy in another district said something, it's a nightmare. But what oftentimes happens on a 1 through 4 system, if you move it to that direction, right? And this might be confusing to new teachers here, but if you make a 4 100% and you make a 3 at 85%, I think that that's a disservice to kids, right? Because what you're saying is that the most difficult thing to be able to get to is mastery of everything immediately. It means that you're going to have very low grades immediately. My recommendation is on that same scale would be 100 is 4 is 100, a 3, which is proficient, should be a 93 or something, right? A 2, which is a printer, should be like an 85, right? And then a 1 should be like a 78. And then like you're not doing anything, that's an F, right? Which is should be at a 59, not a 0, right? Or whatever your scale is. So, my schools never had Fs, to be honest with you. Boyle County didn't do that. But Amy, if you're struggling with that big time, then reach out to me. I'm happy to set up a quick call for you to just walk through clear examples of this and how we're thinking about it. And what that might be, because there's some schools that do like a 4-point mastery scale, some do a 2-point scale, some do a 3, right? And so, some just do colors. It's all over the place, right? But I'm more than happy. And if that becomes a big thing, then Kay, that a lot of people reach out about, then we can talk about, that kind of element. But if not, please reach out, Ryan.new@Jefferson, and I'm happy to explain our thinking about it. But again, it's just one way of thinking about it. So thank you guys very much for getting into the mud and the weeds with me on assessment today. If things are not as clear as that you thought they would be at the very end, I'm sorry if you feel like I've baited you in that way. The goal here is to say that this is very important. It's super complicated. Let's think about how we're assessing kids, what we want out of it, how we're helping kids assess themselves, what we want out of that process, what language we use, and how can we, not have to do, different assessments at different times and reinventing the wheel and all these other aspects of it. So thank you guys very much. But again, Ryan.new@Jefferson, or you can reach out. I think it's like Twitter. Sometimes people will just DM me on Twitter. That's also fine. I think it's at JCP or at social. I can't remember. Let me look it up. my apologies. It's on the very first slide. I don't remember what this is.
I'll put them both on the active agenda.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Amy, please reach out to me. And if anybody has any questions or thoughts, then by all means, I'll stay on for a little bit and I can go through more specific examples if you guys need me to.
So glad that nobody's going to quit their job now. Hopefully we'll do some more training on this and it'll make it even more clear, but it's a difficult conversation, I think. And it is hard.